Call to order this regular meeting of the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Commission of November 14th, 2018. A printed agenda is available outside the hearing room, and a copy of the full agenda, including the staff reports, is available at the front of the chambers with the clerk. The Open Meetings Act is posted just inside the doors at the back of the room. If you are parked in the parking garage across the street to the north, please be sure to pick up a parking coupon on your way out for free parking. And out of courtesy for those attending this meeting, the commissioners and the staff, cellular phone usage is not permitted in these chambers during any portion of this meeting. We will appreciate your cooperation. Please note that the Planning Commission action today is final on the following agenda items. Item 1.2, Special Permit 06022B, and Item 1.3, Special Permit 18034. Any aggrieved person may appeal final action of the Planning Commission to the City Council or the County Board by filing a notice of appeal with the City Clerk or with the Clerk within 14 days following the action of the Planning Commission. Planning Commission action on all other items is a recommendation to the City Council or County Board. The first item of business is the approval of the minutes of the regular meeting held on October 24th, 2018. Is there a motion?
Second, Washington.
Okay, please call the roll.
Beckius?
Yes.
Campbell?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0.
The next item of business is the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda will be called at the same time and will not be scheduled for a separate public hearing unless there is a request from someone wishing to speak or at the request of a commission member. I will ask Jerry to read all of the consent agenda items into the record. Once those items are read, she will ask if there is anyone wishing to speak. If you wish to speak on an item on the consent agenda, we would ask that you stand and state that item. That item will then be removed from the consent agenda and scheduled as a separate public hearing under Section 3 of today's agenda. All items remaining on the consent agenda will be voted upon in total with a motion for approval. Jerry, will you please call the items on the consent agenda?
Yes. Item 1.1 is change of zone 08041B from AGR Agricultural Residential District to R3 PUD Residential Planned Unit Development to expand the existing PUD by approximately 16.63 acres to allow single-family residential and up to 12,500 square feet of commercial floor area on property generally located at 6501 Pine Lake Road. I will note that Commissioner Shear has declared a conflict of interest on this item. Item 1.2, a special permit 06022B to expand the limits of the garden center on property generally located at 10901 and 10777 South 14th Street. This is final action on this item unless appealed to the City Council within 14 days. Special permit Item 1.3, a special permit 18034 to allow for soil excavation on property generally located at south or west of 14th Street between Rokeby Road and Saltillo Road. Again, this is final action on this item unless appealed to the City Council within 14 days. Item 1.4 is use permit 10001A to allow a waiver to the front yard setback requirement for a freestanding sign to be set back a minimum of 15 feet instead of the required 25 feet from the front property line on property generally located at 1040 North Cotner Boulevard. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed?
I see none.
Is there anyone here wishing to speak on any consent agenda items? If so, please state that item.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not certain yet, and we're still discussing something at the back of the room. We have an agreed upon waiver request on item 1 that I don't know whether we need to do this at a public hearing or not, and I'm kind of waiting for a determination back there, but it's all, as I say, it's all agreed upon, so I'm not sure we need one or not. Brian's going to tell us.
Okay.
One for the clerk. Are you going to, is there a motion to amend on that condition relative to the easement, the language we agreed to?
Can we vote on the rest?
Do we
and
want to
pull that one?
pull
and
Yeah, I
do
think we
that
need to
one
just
later?
pull it. so that we move on.
Yes, there's one revision that it needs to come off for consent for us to talk about for sure.
Okay.
We'll figure out about the second one in the meantime.
Okay, so we'll pull item 1.1, changes zone 08041B from the consent agenda, and schedule for a separate public hearing as item 3.1. Okay,
Okay, so then the remaining items, we will entertain a motion to approve.
I'll move
On
approval as
consent.
amended.
Second, Campbell.
Were there any amendments?
Or sorry, with the removal of 1.1.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready to
Okay.
entertain a motion.
okay, to vote?
Yes.
Yes, we're ready to vote.
All right, Becky is?
Sorry.
Yes.
That's okay. Campbell?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0.
Okay, there are no requests for deferral, so we will now proceed to public hearings. The staff will make a brief presentation, then the applicant will be requested to present his or her testimony, followed by those who wish to testify in support, followed by those who wish to testify in opposition. If during your testimony you have copies of documents or materials you would like distributed to the Planning Commission members and/or included as part of the record, please provide that information to Jerry for distribution. The staff will then be given an opportunity to respond to the testimony, and then the applicant shall have an opportunity for rebuttal. Each person testifying should state their name and address and shall have 5 minutes to speak unless additional time is requested and granted. The timer will go off after 4 minutes, then you will have 1 minute to wrap up your testimony. The Planning Commission will vote immediately at the close of the public hearing unless the Commission votes to defer action or continue the public hearing. Jerry, please call the first public hearing item.
Okay, I will call item, I will call change of zone 08041B as item 3.1 for public hearing. It's from AG Agricultural Residential District to R3 Residential District Plan Unit Development to expand the existing PUD by approximately 16.63 acres to allow single-family residential and up to 12,500 square feet of commercial floor area on property generally located at 6501 Pine Lake Road. Staff recommendation is for conditional approval. There were no ex parte communications.
Go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, Brian Will, Planning Department. This one probably sounds familiar because we've talked about it at least 2 times in the past. Just to refresh everybody's memory, this is the Pine Garden Planned Unit Development. And the area that we're talking about here is South 70th Street on the east, Pine Lake Road here to the north. Recall initially the PUD included these 2 lots here. That was Realty Trust at the time for some office, some limited commercial and residential along the south. It was just earlier this year that we amended that PUD to include this adjacent 3-acre lot to the west. That was to allow the owner to, who was at that time downsizing his automotive repair business, to allow him to relocate it into the existing buildings, no new development, existing buildings on the property at that time. Well, today then, this PUD is back before you today to be expanded by approximately another 16 acres. And, sorry, I pointed to this lot, I meant to this one. Today it's being expanded to include 1, 2, 3 lots. And notice these 2 lots are very deep. These lots are being brought in to the PUD and will be included in its boundary if approved. What I would note is that this triangular lot right here has a single-family dwelling in it. That owner, property owner, to my knowledge, hasn't been actively participating, but is not objecting to be included in the PUD. This larger tract right here is the site of the new Lincoln Fire Rescue police substation, which is currently under construction. And then it's this westernmost lot here that is bringing the PUD back today. The owners are requesting that 12,500 square feet of floor area for contractor services be allowed on this property. They currently have a building that has been constructed, but there's also a single-family dwelling. Sorry. This is the building here that I'm referring to, and the single-family dwelling right here. It's adjacent to Pine Lake Road. So if this amendment today is approved, it would allow then contractor services, which would allow this contractor or drywall business to be located out of this building and continue to use a single-family dwelling for residential purposes. I use this other graphic here to sort of illustrate. This is a sort of an unusual circumstance here, using a PUD to begin with, which we don't use that often. But it's really in response to the properties involved and the constraints that we find in this area in particular. This you'll recognize as the railroad track that extends through this section. Of course, Beal Slough, and then the other drainage, the outlet from Pine Lake. These factors combine to sort of cut off this part of the section from the rest, and it just makes development in a way that makes it part of the larger residential development within the section more difficult. So it was with the PUD that we've tried to address those issues and allow some limited uses on these properties so that the property owners have some benefit in the meantime. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yes, it's coming off of consent. What's the issue that we're going to be discussing?
Well, that was the applicant's request. There was a modified condition that I think he wants to address.
Okay.
Any other questions for staff? Okay, testimony from the applicant, please.
Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission, Mark Hunziker. I'm appearing on behalf of Franklin Drywall, the applicant in this matter. Two small items, both of which we've had quite a bit of discussion with the staff about, and I think have agreement on. There is a requirement in the staff report, if I can find it again, which requires that the applicant submit a grading and drainage plan to provide detention. That's item 1.16 on the staff report. And I believe we're okay to delete it. We would ask that that be deleted. And the reason for that is as you could see from the graphics that Brian put up, we're immediately next to the creek, and it's very unusual to require detention when you're that close to the creek. Detention is something that you do upstream to slow down the flow of water into the lower reaches of the watershed. At the lower end, you want to get that water into the creek just as quickly as possible. So we'd ask that you remove that. Then there was also a requirement at 1.10, 1.10, to show a 24-foot wide access easement granted to the lot adjacent to the west of Lot 15, Block 2, to allow shared access to the driveway median opening on Pine Lake Road. We didn't object to the concept of that, but we did discuss with the staff circumstances under which that easement ought to have to be granted. And we are willing to grant that easement under the following conditions. That the easement shall not be effective until the earlier of the following. 1, the owner of Lot 15, Block 2, remodels the existing house to provide, either remodels the existing house to provide a garage access to the east or south, and the owner to the west paves a driveway from the existing Pine Lake Road access, or the owner of the property to the west applies for and is granted approval of inclusion of its property in the Pine Lake Garden PUD and agrees to pay for remodeling the existing, and agrees to pave the driveway from the existing Pine Lake Road access and to maintain it in perpetuity. In other words, we're willing to grant the 24-foot easement, and it's going to be right in front of the house. It's the setback of the garage is 30 feet from Pine Lake Road. But we're going to be granting a 24-foot wide access easement through our front yard over to the Campus Life property. And we want that access easement to be effective only at such time as we change the use of that house to commercial, or that the property to the west comes in and makes an application and gets approval for some use other than what they have there now, and they agree to pay for the improvement of that driveway. And we're, either way, is our understanding is that the Campus Life property, or whether it's, or the owner at that time, will pay for the paving and maintain that easement, but only at such time, they only get it at such time as we either change the use of that house or they come into the PUD and have some other use for their property. And I will say today we've had further discussions with the owner. It's very likely that we're going to come in here and ask for an administrative amendment very soon to convert that house into the office for the business that's going to be on that property. It makes a lot more sense than to remodel the house and try to use it for residential at this point.
Are you suggesting the 1.10 is a separate agreement? I'm assuming that all of that doesn't go in the conditions.
No, I think it goes in the condition.
Okay.
I have a question then about 1.10.
Okay.
Because I heard one thing and then I heard a second thing. One of the stipulations that you made was that that would only go into effect if the house were remodeled to provide garage access, and then you talked about the house being remodeled for commercial. So
you're right. You did hear two different things, and I was reading from an early draft of my proposed condition. On the earlier of the two, Franklin Drywall changes the use of the house or removes the house to convert that property to commercial use, or the Campus Life property is included in the PUD, and that owner agrees to pave the access easement and agree to be responsible for its maintenance. And so they end up, our understanding is that we just grant the easement. If they want the access, they have to pave it and maintain it. And we'll live with that at such time as we either change the use of the house or they change the use of their property.
Mark, you said that there's a 30-foot setback to the house.
Yes.
In 1.10, it's got a 24-foot wide access easement, but it's only got a required 20-foot. It's got a required 20-foot setback. So how do you get that in 30?
That we can't, and that second sentence needs to be deleted as well. That it can't be outside the 20-foot front yard because there's just not enough room. Thank you.
Okay.
And you're saying the first of the two either-ors that you described is likely to happen?
Yes, I believe it is.
That's likely what would be the result?
I believe it's likely that the house will be converted to an office for the business sooner than later. I think they've discovered that it's economically a better use of the house to have it used as office than to take up space in their larger commercial building for that purpose.
I have a question about 1.16. You asked that that condition be removed in its entirety. And the way I had read that was, it was to revise the grading and drainage plan to provide detention or to show that there was no increase in runoff. And are you opposed to showing no increase in runoff?
We're not opposed to showing no increase in runoff because we're not changing anything. The building is there, the parking lot's there. We're not doing anything to increase the runoff, other than if the driveway gets built, then we would.
Sandra, Tim Gergen with Clark Anderson Partners. After talking with Watershed last week on this, the condition was back from 1999 of no increase, and so there has been a building built to there. The justification of that is our proximity to the floodway. If we would provide detention on the property, we would be releasing that stormwater at the same time as the peak stormwater is going through that channel. So often with properties, we want to not have detention because we want the water adjacent to those floodways to get in and off the property into the channel so it can make its way downstream and detain at properties that are more upstream.
I recognize the detention piece is redundant so close to the floodway. It was the statement on the other side of or, which was about runoff, amount of runoff.
Right, and so I think maybe Brian Will is going to be up here in a little bit for rebuttal on that, and maybe we don't strike 1.16 but modify it to state that we will show a stormwater detention waiver with justification for our waiver, and we don't have any opposition for meeting the stormwater quality requirements. It's just the stormwater detention.
Okay.
I want to make sure that I've got the 1.10 accurate here. So if Franklin Drywall changes their house on this lot, if they remodel it, change it to commercial use, then you don't want to have to do the easement.
Then the easement would be effective at that time if they do that.
Okay, or second part is if Campus Life property is added to the PUD.
Right, and the use changed.
Okay.
And in either case, they pave the driveway and maintain it.
Okay. Any other questions for applicant right now?
No.
Okay, then we will go to testimony and support. Do we have any testimony and support? Okay, testimony in opposition. I don't see any, so I think, Brian, that means you're back up. How does staff feel about these changes?
Yeah, no, we agree. We've had discussions previously today about these changes. Relative to the access easement, we're good with that. Makes sense, and so we do not object to that. We've also been engaged with Public Works, Watershed Management, relative to this grading and drainage issue. There's probably a lot of different ways to state it, but I think the way Tim said it is fine. We want to leave the condition there, perhaps modify it. We all agree that the place we want to get to with it, and that we can. So other than that, I think we're fine with the changes that are being proposed.
So what modification would you make to 1.6?
No. Whatever was stated by the applicant and the way the conditions are to be phrased, we're good with that.
Okay.
Were you okay with striking the 20-foot front yard part?
Yeah, I think we have to, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Other questions for Brian? Okay. Applicant rebuttal. Do you have anything more?
Can you come back up and repeat what you're recommending as?
Yeah, so
change to 1.6?
Essentially, what we're going to be
Yeah, 1.16.
striking the first part of 1.16, revise the grading and drainage plan to provide detention or show there is no increase in runoff from the proposed improvements. So we'll be striking that part. We will be leaving in place, provide a proposal to meet the water quality standards or prove the disturbance is less than 1 acre. We'll keep that part. And in replace of the text that we stricken, it would be replaced by provide justification for a waiver of the stormwater detention requirements, of which we will provide that back to planning and public works.
And would you show, would that wording note that there'd be no increase in runoff?
At this point, since it dates back to 1999, I don't believe we can show that there is an increase, no net increase in runoff because of the existing building that was built from last year or earlier this year.
I don't think they're asking this to go back to 99, that this language may be old, but it's going to be applied currently.
When we met with Watershed, they were assuming it was going back to 1999. But if it goes back to our application, then we would agree with there is no increase in detention.
So I'm a little, I know this doesn't maybe that important to the application before us now, but was this commercial building built without a permit? I mean,
it was built with a permit. It was built with a permit as a storage unit in an AGR zoning, and the change of zone is coming back as a reflection to change that zoning so that it can be built into a drywall business.
So at the time that it was built, even though they weren't in the PUD, I mean, was there still no increase in runoff present?
At the time, there is no requirement for that in the AGR zoning and for that building permit process.
Okay.
Can I ask a point of clarification of staff? Because I just want to make certain I'm reading conditions correctly when we have conditions set forward. Are all of these conditions to harken back to 1999? So these are all in arrears coming forward? Or are these current conditions?
These are current conditions. Yes. And
so except for the one that Watershed or Stormwater wants to push to 99, the rest of them are to be read currently.
I'm not quite sure
It is a little murky.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm not sure the distinction is important, to be honest with you. Here's what I'm telling you.
All right.
We've met. We have a meeting of the minds between the applicant, Public Works, and the Planning Department. The language that was described here, that's fine.
All right.
But
There aren't any others that talk about an increase or so, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that it would matter to any of the other conditions.
That's correct, ma'am.
Right. Correct.
I'm just, if for consistency, if I read 1.10 as this is something being requested, and so we're looking at that, I would think that 1.16 was also being requested. But I didn't read it as this is a historical reference point. So I can live, if you're fine with the agreement, if you all understand that the water is moving directly into the floodway.
Yep.
And that it poses no problem in quantity or quality, I will agree.
That is exactly what my brethren from Public Works would tell you. They would nod their heads and say yes.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for applicant? Okay, so Jerry, I think we're ready. No, we have to entertain a motion first.
I want to move approval with 1.10 and 1.116 being amended, and I'm going to leave it open for the planning and the applicant to word that to the intent of what was said today.
I'll second Becky's.
Discussion?
It's a
No?
meeting of the minds.
Yeah,
Okay.
That we're ready to move forward.
Yeah.
I think I know where Sandra's coming from. I'm concerned about, the increase in runoff for people downstream, but if the staff feel that that's protected, then I'm okay with it. So, Jerry, I think we're ready now.
Okay, this is for the conditional approval of changes zone 08041A as amended. Beckius?
Yes.
Campbell?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
Jerry, it was 08041B.
Oh, I'm sorry. Changes zone 08041B. You're right. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that ends the first public hearing item, so we're ready for the second one.
Okay, moving on. Item 4.1 is text amendment 18014, amending Lincoln Municipal Code sections 27.60.060, 27.63.030, 27.64.010, figure 27.67.020 parking matrix, 27.67.030, 27.67.040, add a new section 27.67.045 and 27.67.065 to revise parking requirements, and appealing the same sections as hitherto existing. Also amending Title III Design Standards for Zoning Regulations by amending Chapter 3.45, Section 3, and Section 3.7, Chapter 3.50, Sections 1 through 6, 7.1 through 7.11, Chapter 3.76, Section 1.4, and Chapter 3.77, Section 4.3 to revise the design standards for screening and landscaping and related changes to other design standard chapters, and repealing said chapters and sections as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed?
Yes, Jerry. I was present at the mayor's roundtable both in October and November when planning staff presented these changes.
Thank you.
I was present at 2 meetings of the Realtors Association of Lincoln where they discussed this item. I also had a discussion with Lincoln at Hampton. Lincoln has submitted his thoughts on the proposal earlier, and I think everyone's already received a copy of those comments.
Noted. Thank
Any
you.
others? No others. Rachel?
Rachel Jones, Planning Department, and I'm here with Colin Christopher, also from Planning. This is a text amendment proposed by the Planning Department related to parking, screening and landscaping for parking lots, and street tree requirements. And we briefed the Planning Commission in detail on these changes on October 24th. So this package of changes was really thoughtfully designed to balance parking reductions and some additional flexibility on parking standards to help encourage development with enhanced screening and landscaping. So it's meant to balance, on the one hand, developer incentives to help encourage development with additional aesthetic and greening improvements. And as you saw in the staff report, the comprehensive plan directs us to pursue a number of strategies, including improving and enforcing our design standards, promoting shared parking, adding mechanisms for flexibility in our zoning where appropriate, and increasing the citywide equity of applying these regulations. And the comprehensive plan as an adopted document is what guides our planning decisions, and it's providing the reasoning and the support for these changes. And I'll emphasize these are intended to be incremental steps towards achieving those goals of the comprehensive plan and not a major overhaul of our standards. These were presented to the roundtable, the neighborhood roundtable on November 5th, and to the Urban Design Committee on November 6th. The Urban Design Committee made a unanimous recommendation of approval with several conditions they requested staff to consider, and so we'll go over those with you shortly. But to start with the parking changes, there are several purposes that the parking changes serve in terms of why we are moving forward with them and what they are intended to do. So first of all, reducing minimum parking where it makes sense to reduce overparking of sites because of city requirements, supporting development, redevelopment and denser development through added flexibility, and allowing for administrative parking modifications that'll better serve the development community while still taking into account potential effects on neighboring property. And in terms of the changes themselves, it involves reductions to minimum standard parking in several cases. We're also expanding the opportunities for offsite parking, and then we have a few other changes that kind of fall under the umbrella of increasing flexibility with expanding where you can park on a site, expanding shared parking, and creating a process for administrative minor parking modifications. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colin.
Colin Christopher, Planning Department. I will go over the landscape changes. These are driven, of course, as Rachel mentioned, by recommendations of the comp plan, as well as this balancing of reduced parking versus increased landscape standards, but also some staff analysis on the current standards and how they could be better applied, and an aim to raise the design standard to match current commercial standards that already exist in the development community. So I've divided these changes up into 3 different categories: parking lot landscaping, open space landscaping, and street trees. And I'll just give a brief overview of each of those 3. So let's start with parking lot landscaping. Effective parking lot landscaping can have a significant impact on the appearance and functionality of the built environment. The proposed changes aim to soften the visual harshness of surface lots through attractive screening and landscaping, while also still preserving sightlines into properties. They also aim to create more consistent application of the screening and landscaping of parking lots and eliminate the missing teeth effect that we often see along commercial corridors. And finally, they reduce heat islands, stormwater runoff and pollution, and other environmental impacts of parking lots. So specifically the way in which we intend to address these goals, and we did do a briefing with you, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but just broadly, we're proposing to remove or clarify unnecessary parking lot screening exemptions. We are also proposing to require a very small increase in the number of parking lot shade trees. And then finally, we are proposing to require internal parking lot landscape islands for trees to be placed in. So those 2 are kind of coordinated with one another. The second category is open space landscaping. This is a requirement that exists in very specific zones or districts that allow for larger development, so it's really targeting those larger development opportunities. And the intent here is to provide a very minor increase in the open space requirement. The current standard requires 3 shade trees and 400 square feet of understory planting per 10,000 square feet of building coverage. The new requirement would increase that to 4 shade trees and 700 square feet. I will point out, just for clarification on this one, we call it open space landscaping. We don't actually have a open space requirement within our standards. So open space landscaping could be applied anywhere on the site. It could be around parking lots, around buildings, entry drives, or an actual dedicated open space. The final category is street trees, and the intent here is pretty straightforward. We believe that street trees can have great value to a community. They frame views and enhance the urban form of our streets. They make streets more inviting, more comfortable and safe. Drivers tend to slow down and residents walk more on streets lined by trees. They mitigate a variety of typical urban conditions, improving air quality and reducing noise pollution for adjacent properties. And finally, they typically lead to increased property values for adjacent properties. So the current standard as it applies now, street trees are only required for subdivisions or as a condition of a PUD, a use permit, or a special permit. What this is proposing is that street trees would be required in a typical commercial building permitting process under one of the following two conditions. One would be new construction, and the second one would be major additions or reinvestments in a property where the total construction valuation exceeds 50% of the property's assessed value. So as Rachel mentioned, I just want to hit pause here. At our Urban Design Committee, they did approve these changes unanimously, but they did have some concerns, and two of those concerns were related directly to the street tree requirement. And essentially, there are issues related to the threshold that we've identified and how that may impact development projects, and then a concern that this requirement would lead to an increase in an already slow permit review process. So to maybe just summarize how that conversation went, there was a specific example identified of if we had a interior remodel project that wouldn't have typically required not only street trees but any landscaping. In that scenario, a developer or a consultant would now be required to provide a landscape plan when they otherwise would not have been required to provide one if it surpasses that 50% threshold. And in doing so, another entity, in this case Parks and Rec, is now asked to provide comment on the permit plans, which in their opinion could slow down the process. So we're not going to be able to, as part of this amendment, tackle the overall slow permit review process. That's something that we understand is an issue, and that interdepartmentally we are exploring possibilities to improve that. But we can specifically address it in this particular case. And when we briefed you 2 weeks ago, I think I mentioned that there was not an intent to require every interior remodel or every tenant finish to go through this street tree requirement. And the thought was that that 50% threshold would filter out much of those. But in reality, there may be some that don't get filtered out. And so to address their concerns and to hopefully provide some additional clarity in how this street tree requirement gets applied, we did revise this language. Rachel's put it up on the screen. I'll just read through it here for clarity. So there are still two conditions. The number one is new construction. That has not changed. The second condition, which has, now reads, major additions or reinvestments in a property where the total investment, defined as total construction valuation, exceeds 50% of the property's assessed value to commencement of construction. This condition shall not include improvement projects solely intended to address interior remodels or tenant finishes where the exterior of the building and site are not being impacted. So that last sentence, I think, is really the key part of that, and that will, we believe, resolve Urban Design Committee's issues and tighten up this requirement to allow it to focus on the things we think it should be focusing on. So those are the major changes. In addition to those, we have a number of very small changes. I'm not going to run through those because, again, we went through those in the briefing, but they're related just to some general cleanup, consolidation, and minor adjustments within the design standards. I'll just point out that none of those will have any impact on the actual level of screening provided or required. And so that is our overall review of both the parking and the landscape changes. And with that, I think we'll open it up to questions.
I have questions on a few different portions, but I'll start with what you were just talking about, since we were on that already. So, when I read the minutes from the Urban Design Committee, I was under the impression that they wanted to do away with the 50% trigger. It says, Penn is unsure of the 50% regulation. Houston would recommend removing that provision. Street trees continue with new construction, but the second threshold of 50% is eliminated. And Houston moved approval with that.
I would say there was some debate on whether it needed to go away entirely or whether it could be resolved.
So that's not in the minutes? That debate's not in the minutes?
It's probably not fully fleshed out in the minutes. Typically, those are not every comment is recorded. I would say there was a lot of discussion within that really did focus on that interior remodel or tinted finish example. And so from my perspective, that was really the major concern that they were discussing. There was some discussion about eliminating it entirely. I don't want to make it sound like that didn't happen.
What do you think Mr. Houston moved? Did he move approval of the package with the 50% trigger removed? Or did he move approval with something, with an intent closer to what you have here?
I think that that's moot, because by putting the wording that is in there, that does get rid of the 50% if it's only interior, which is how, maybe I have a wrong impression, but I think that's what they were extremely worried about.
Well, it's not moot to me, because this comes with all kinds of other issues like enforcement and how do you measure, how do you get access to the information. So my question still stands. Do you have a firm grasp of what was moved at the meeting?
I can't say that definitively. I do believe, though, the approval with conditions did ask us for consideration of this. I don't know, did it specifically say these are the conditions?
No, the 50% piece was definitely brought up by Houston at the beginning, and then there was some further discussion, and I think in the end, at least according to the minutes, the motion was to generally consider narrowing that scope of those standards and how they apply, to make sure that they aren't catching things like just strictly interior remodels that really shouldn't trigger the street tree installation.
Was the concern of the 50% a concern about interior remodels, or was it a concern about having the trigger in the first place?
I had the sense
Enforcement
that a majority of the committee understood that in cases of new development or additions or major improvement projects, that was reasonable to expect street trees. Almost the entirety of that conversation really did focus around those examples where you are not impacting either the building, the exterior building, or the site itself.
So, presuming the 50% trigger stays in place and is approved, could you talk a little bit to the practicality and the enforcement of that rule?
It is an ongoing discussion. It's certainly achievable. The goal is we have some of this information that would allow us to make that 50% determination as part of a typical building permit application. And so it would simply be a matter of hopefully automating that so that there isn't a lot of extra labor required to make that calculation, so that it's just part of the process. In terms of enforcement, it would go along with the way that all other landscape enforcements are set up right now. Once it's in the system, there is a record that gets triggered that would require someone to go out and make sure that it's being applied.
And is this public information, or would you solicit the developer for this financial information?
We require on their application to submit total construction valuation.
You would base it on that?
So we base it on that. Sometimes we can tell that that number isn't exactly accurate. We're asking them to provide us a number. So, and that's something that Building and Safety does. It's not Planning Department, but we do rely on that total valuation that they submit.
Would you be open to language that did not require this in the case of a catastrophic event?
So we did do some research because you asked that question at the briefing about an act of God scenario. And we also asked law and their opinion on this. And I think our opinion and their opinion line up. And that would be that in the case of, let's say, a tornado that wipes out a building entirely, and the property owner wants to come in and just build a new building, that is new development, and we would consider that new construction, and the requirement would be applied. But in a case where there is damage in which the building is ultimately just going to be restored, even if it goes beyond that 50% threshold, we would allow them to repair or restore it without triggering not just this standard, but any of the design standards. That would not be a scenario where the design standards would apply.
Like a bad flooding or
Correct.
fire or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a scenario where something like that happens and the property owner says, we're just going to demo this and start over and do something else. And in that case, that really is new development. But in those other scenarios, this would not trigger that requirement.
I have some other questions, but I'm assuming there are others, so I'll.
Are there others? I have some too, but.
There are.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My one question was very similar to Maya's, and because I read the last paragraph of the committee notes as removing the requirement for the street trees on interior work. And I appreciate the second sentence, the revised, that says this condition shall not include improvement projects solely intended to address interior remodels. And as long as that is understood, I am fine with it. But I think that triggering street trees based on interior remodels is asking too much. I think that triggering street trees for major additions or exterior refinements or changes to the property makes sense, but not interior. And I would have probably been more particular about wording, but if everybody understands that to be the case, I'm fine with it.
Going down that line of thinking about street trees a little bit, since we're there, are owners, developers going to be required to escrow for street trees?
I would probably refer back to the street tree standards. My guess is that no, that would simply be a street tree would be required as part of their landscape improvements. That it's a little bit different than how subdivisions work, where they're paying beforehand. That in this case, they're required to do street trees, so when they do their other landscape improvements, they would do those trees as well.
Okay. I think that's all I have for street trees.
Where would the equity come in place? If one of the goals was equity across the city and subdivisions require street trees and they're escrowed, why not bring that forward into the commercial districts?
I will say that's probably not something we've looked at too closely, but to me this is simply a matter of how do you get the street trees installed? So the way to do that is require them as part of the commercial building permitting process, in which case they're just making these improvements as part of their improvement project.
Okay.
Steve Hendrickson with the Planning Department. Since we do a lot of final plats and escrows, I can help explain with that. One is often a matter of scale. We have very large subdivisions where we're having water and sewer lines and hundreds of thousands of dollars of improvements putting in. It takes a lot of work to do an escrow, to process it, for the applicant to put it up. So, but given the hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, it is worth it. Here where you have 1 or 2 trees, we don't escrow today already required parking lot trees or landscaping. We don't escrow the parking lot surfacing. You know, so there's a lot of things in there. It's also, often it's an internal improvement. I am coming forward, I want to get this plan built, versus in the subdivision process, it's a developer putting this forward, he's going to sell it to multiple people. You're trying to ensure that those improvements are done because the lots are then sold to somebody else.
Thank you.
One other question I had. We don't have this requirement today. Why do you think that is?
Fruit tree requirement? I think that the concern that we often hear, particularly on commercial corridors, is that there's some fear of losing visibility into sites. So I think that's a significant one. And my guess would be that in previous commercial design standard considerations, that was taken into consideration because of comments from the development community, that there was fear of that.
It's also the case that during the subdivision process, we get, escrows for all kinds of other improvements as well. So it's kind of a natural time to get it then, whereas at time of building permit, historically, it hasn't been something that was looked at.
There's also just the simple fact that even though we, I think, understand the value of street trees, they are being located in a public right-of-way versus a private property. So there's some balance there of requesting a private property to provide trees that are located outside of their property.
Anyone else on street trees?
Mine's not a street tree question.
Why don't you lead us our next line of questioning?
Mine is a question that is related to the Urban Design Committee meeting, but is not a street tree question. Can you provide a little more context on the discussion that Urban Design Committee member Casper talked about regarding linking stormwater and the requirements, not requirements, but the need to deal with stormwater, which is more and more prevalent now on a site, to landscape, either screening or planting in parking lots. I brought this up at the briefing, the last briefing, and it was interesting that she brought that up at the Urban Design Committee meeting. I think that's a big deal because our sites are not going to get any bigger, but there's more and more requirements for those of us who deal in design on these sites to provide solutions for different things. And very often a stormwater landscape solution is not exactly the same kind of landscape as a parking lot screen landscape. It would be really great if we could figure out how to allow that to happen in an integrated kind of way. Can you provide a little context to that discussion and how that might link to what we might be concerned about?
Yeah, it was a fairly brief comment, similar to your comment, very similar. But I think the consideration is a really good one, and it's something we should be thinking about. And as stormwater management not only becomes more of an issue, but as the city tries to deal with it in a regulatory way, there's a great opportunity to try to combine those two efforts. The reality is it's going to take a lot more thought and coordination on our part to make that work, and so it's probably unrealistic to include it as part of this amendment, but I definitely think because we've heard it a number of times now that it's something that we would consider. And I'll also say there's nothing in what we're proposing that would eliminate somebody from taking on a more sustainable solution like that. There's nothing that says that your curbs have to be 6 inches, for instance, on your islands. So if somebody wanted to incorporate rain gardens or bioretention areas as part of this interior landscape island requirement, they could do that. We're not saying they can't, we just aren't requiring it or coordinating it at this time, but I definitely think it's...
But my point is that it takes space to do that, which is required. And just as an example, I'm not saying that this is the example, but it's an example, to require a few more internal street trees in a parking lot, a large parking lot. That space could also be devoted to taking care of the stormwater by a retention area or something, but bioretention doesn't work sometimes well with some of the shade tree requirements that might be required with this. And it'd be good to be able to integrate that. So
Yeah.
that, because there's only so much space that you have on a site to deal with, and the requirements are not getting less, they're getting more.
Sure. And I think that would be something that if we were to go down that path of encouraging stormwater management within sites, that allowing some of those exceptions for shade trees replace it with a bioretention area that maybe isn't going to be the most suitable for a shade tree.
How would that process look until those discussions happen with Public Works and something would get modified? Is that discretion with planning director? Is that part of that clause?
You're describing a scenario where someone wanted to do that on their own.
Right.
The shade tree gets in the way of that. Yeah, I think that is something that we could probably administratively approve through a waiver process in a circumstance like that.
Okay. Other questions?
I
Anything?
have some parking requirement questions. I think that you, Rachel, and I talked a little bit yesterday, so I have to pull up the, it's about the reducing the minimum parking for restaurants and on-sale alcohol in the B2 and B5 zoning districts from 1 stall per 100 square feet to 1 stall per 300 square feet. You talked about it a little bit, and it's on page 50 in the staff report. So my question is, I already asked you this, but I'll kind of ask it again, and you can kind of give your response. So if you look at the ordinance the way it is now, we're basically giving more leniency to B1 and B3 when it comes to restaurants. And I'm assuming that that's because of the more, walk-in traffic, and B2 and B5 have traditionally been viewed as more auto-oriented districts, and now we're talking about flipping the ordinance, and I realize it's basically codifying a lot of stuff that is being done already, but from a sort of philosophical viewpoint, what does that mean? What does that say to our older districts that we know are struggling with some ways to revitalize?
Yes. So you're correct. A few years ago, we reduced the parking requirement for restaurants and on-sale alcohol in B1 and B3. And we'd now be proposing to modify it for B2 and B5. That would actually create a lower parking requirement for them. And basically the answer is that these zoning districts have different settings or circumstances where we would have the parking requirements be that way. And so B2 and B5 are our commercial centers, regional centers, like Edgewood, South Point, East Park, all of those are B5. And like you said, this change would basically be codifying something we've done individually on a lot of those use permits. We also recently reduced parking, the minimum standard parking in B5 from 4.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet to 1 space per 300 square feet. So it's kind of a pattern and a precedent for that. And in those commercial centers, usually there's a lot of parking. It's an abundance of parking. Many times they share parking across uses that might have peak demands at different times of day. Often they're pretty separated from the nearby neighborhoods with large setbacks. And so for those reasons, the parking is fairly self-contained within those centers. But in our older districts, our older commercial districts like B1 and B3, obviously sites are usually smaller in those areas, a little more difficult to develop. And the space to provide parking on those sites is usually at a premium. It's not like a commercial center where you could usually use or count on some of your neighbors' parking spots if you had customers that couldn't find a spot on your site, because that neighbor is also, counting on having their parking spaces. And so in that case, it's not as simple a matter of saying, oh, I'll just park a little bit farther away from my destination, over on the next pad site. So even though the older districts tend to have more walk-in traffic, like you said, usually tend to have on-street parking nearby, we would still want to preserve and make sure that sufficient parking is definitely provided on those sites. Another consideration is that neighborhood groups in the more central parts of town are often really concerned about overflow parking from those commercial areas into their neighborhoods. And so we also want to be sensitive to that because, that is a concern, whereas in a commercial center, you don't see a lot of overflow parking into neighborhoods.
But on the flip side of that, if you were to reduce the parking requirement for B1 and B3 as well, as the comp plan sort of indirectly tells us to consider reducing the parking requirement to rather than demolishing structures or something like that in our older districts. Isn't it possible that reducing the parking requirement in our older commercial districts would spark development and help revitalize, especially if you view this as a package and not in a vacuum where the added cost will be felt across the board, but the I think you call them developer incentives will not be felt by B1 and B3. Granted, they did have a little bit of a more lenient parking requirement to begin with. I guess my question is, why not use this package to throw a carrot to B1 and B3?
And I think to that I would say, I think we do have carrots in here for them, especially the minor parking modifications. I think we're anticipating that the minor parking reduction administratively is going to really serve those businesses in the older parts of town that struggle to fit quite enough parking on their site and can maybe on a case-by-case basis justify or demonstrate why they shouldn't have to meet the standard. So
you're saying the administrative amendment process is basically because the shared kind of parking isn't going to work as well for B1 and B3 because they tend to be more, you go to that business and you can't necessarily share the same way that you can in B2 and B5, but so it would be the administrative process that would be the primary carrot?
I think so, and also shared parking. We have established shared parking in a lot of our centers that come through all at once, and they're kind of thought through as a whole area. But I believe we have shared parking scenarios also in many other parts of town, just between individual property owners.
Okay.
So I would think that, it's a good thought, and I think it comes from a good place of wanting to promote equity, and I would say I think the package as a whole probably still addresses that, even though it's in a different way.
Thank you.
Commissioner Harris, do you mind if I follow up on
Oh,
the
go
subject? Rachel, you'd mentioned a couple of times during your discussion here that that this issue was part of a package of give and take. The parking requirement reduction in the B2 and B5 zoning districts probably rang the most hollow with me when it came to a give, if you will. When I think of citing a restaurant in the B2 or B5 zoning district, let's say that restaurant's 2,400 square feet. Are we looking at a required parking amount of 8? Under the proposed?
I would think so, yes.
And I don't think that anyone would actually build a restaurant with only 8 parking stalls.
Sure. Yeah, and that's an important thing to keep in mind is when we talk about parking in the zoning ordinance, we have minimum parking.
Right.
And so we try to set that at a reasonable place. But of course, many businesses provide more than that because they think their customer demand will require it. And so what we're trying to do here is basically not trying to contribute to large expanses of unnecessary parking as the city, and a little bit more allow for individual businesses to decide if they feel like they need to provide more than that, but that the city's minimum shouldn't be set so high that it's just detrimental or inflexible for those that might not need to overpark their site.
Sure. And I don't think that probably having more than 8 stalls at a restaurant of 2,400 square feet is over parking. But I think that the regulation does not jive with current practice. And I don't know that that's I don't think that that's a carrot, if you will, whatsoever, because I think that any operator would go above and beyond city regulation anyway. I don't know that that's a give from my point of view.
Okay.
Other questions?
I do.
Go ahead.
I'm going to be a little bit all over the board here.
It's all right.
On our packet, page 114, describes the potential removal of an occupancy or certificate of occupancy by a building official. Could you discuss that process a little bit as proposed?
That is in line with actually the current procedures, and I can maybe just give you a broad overview of how the procedures work, which is included in that language. When a building receives its certificate of occupancy, or in the case of a site that doesn't have a building, it may be just a final approval of a parking lot, for instance, because they're just doing parking lot improvements. That triggers a landscape enforcement record. And that landscape enforcement record says that at the 6-month mark after that trigger, I am to go out, or whoever's in my place, am to go out and review the landscape to make sure that it's been implemented. The reason for that delay is simply that you may get your occupancy in January and wouldn't be able to do landscaping at that time. So we give a little bit of leeway there when it gets installed. At the point in which we do that review, we find that they haven't installed it or they didn't install it correctly. We will give them a warning and give them 6 months to comply. If they don't comply in that time period, then we will pass that information along to the law department, and law department will essentially make a determination on how to proceed. The worst case scenario is that they would revoke the that occupancy. I would think that the goal is not to do that, that would truly be a worst case scenario, and that we'd work with property owners to make sure that they're meeting the standard, which is really what we're trying to get at. We're not trying to revoke occupancy, we're trying to get them to install their landscaping. So it's in there because we need to have some level of enforcement in order to get property owners to comply. But it certainly wouldn't be the first or second step in that process.
Sure.
I just want to make sure that I heard correctly. That's already in there. We're really just moving it to a different section.
We already have a section for procedures. We have updated it simply because there was some terminology in there that just wasn't accurate. But that potential revocation of the building occupancy was already in the existing standards, yes.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of the new proposals on the the medians in the parking lots, new construction only, correct?
For islands, yes. New construction or additions to parking lots. So.
Okay. Tell me how an addition to a parking lot would occur.
So, and
tell me about that process.
This is how it works now. It's how it would continue to work. If you have a parking lot of, say, 200 stalls, and you demand more than that, and you're going to add on to that parking lot, basically taking the existing line and expanding out in one direction or another, the portion of that that is being added on is the portion that would be required to meet the standards.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. And then I had a question, and these questions are to get a basic understanding for me here. This diagram here that's being shown,
Can you tell us what
it's
page that
Exhibit
is?
1, I apologize, on page 55 of the report. I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding the intent here. On the bottom of the exhibit, it's referencing it seems to me as though it's pointing to a driveway and calling it a drive aisle. And I wanted to make sure I understood the intent of what's being proposed here. On the very bottom, there you go. Yeah. Exactly. Are we only referring to drive aisles that are coming off of driveways, or are we also referring to drive aisles that are running, in this example, horizontally between lots?
It would be an either or. So the intent is to disqualify what I would call not abutting parking lots, but adjacent parking lots that have no connection. So if that connection is achieved either through a common access drive or drive aisles, those would still qualify as abutting.
So the need for a shared driveway is not a part of the requirement?
It is not. That's correct.
Okay. That's what I thought, but I couldn't tell by that diagram if a shared driveway was required or not.
Yeah, it's probably a little confusing because we're combining potential ways to stay within that exemption. But yeah, it's not one or both, it's either or.
Okay. In circumstances where adjoining property owners do not have a formal agreement for cross easement access of parking lots, if one owner were to put up curbing or stop access to the other, tell me how that would impact or trigger landscaping requirements then.
The landscape requirement in that scenario for the property that was affected by the adjacent property putting up a curb, is that what you're asking?
Sure.
In that scenario, they would only be held to the standard they were held to at the point of their building permit. So
okay.
If at that time there was a common access drive or drive aisle and they met that exemption, that they would continue to be allowed to meet that exemption.
Okay, but the current owner who put up the curb would then need to fulfill the obligation of meeting the new requirement. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all I have for right now.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, thanks. We'll probably have you back up again. I think we're ready for testimony in support of this item. Testimony in support. Testimony in opposition of this item.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Mark Hunziker. I'm appearing on behalf of B&J Partnership. B&J, as you know, owns a fair amount of property in the older parts of the community that will be affected by this. First of all, I think it's important for you to understand that there really isn't any balance about this proposal. This is not a balanced proposal in the sense that there are so many incentives granted that the costs and so forth of complying with the new landscape requirements would be offset. That's absolutely not true. Furthermore, there's some implication in the report that there's been quite a bit of input from the development community about this project along the way, and I think that's also a false assumption. The suggestion that these changes will provide incentives simply isn't the case. In fact, at least in one circumstance, and I think you were just speaking to it just a minute ago, between two parking lots, there's a new requirement for landscaping which doesn't exist today, that can only be waived if the two owners are able to agree on cross easements. And so we end up with at least a significant portion of whatever incentive there might be of being allowed to park, say, in the side yard setback, being eliminated by a requirement that you landscape even more along that side than you would otherwise be prohibited from parking in. So because I don't have the luxury of time provided to the staff for their presentation, I'm going to try to highlight in general terms why this proposal should be rejected, or at least at a bare minimum sent back to the planning department with instructions to form some sort of task force, including developers and property owners, to come back with a more reasonable proposal. These parking changes are fine, but they don't come close to compensating for the costs of the proposed screening and landscaping. The screening and landscaping changes are excessive. They require more land in the form of parking islands, more screening area and open space. They're more expensive to design parking lots. They're more expensive to build parking lots. The landscaping materials are greater, and the maintenance requirements are going to be greater. The reduced visibility for businesses is an important consideration, which I think is pointed out to you in the letter that Lincoln Zier sent you from Hampton Development. But also, I think it's important for, particularly in the older parts of the community, to maintain visibility for those small businesses. Reduced visibility and reduced effectiveness of parking lot lighting is a concern with the additional trees. The reduced effectiveness of outside surveillance cameras is a major concern. How many times recently have you seen or read about crimes being thwarted or solved through the use of outdoor surveillance cameras? When you have a bunch of trees in the parking lots, you are not going to get as clear a view of those parking lots. You also don't have the kind of clear view when you require screening from every street for passing police cars to be able to see what's going on in that parking lot. All these things are important to development, new and old, but they will be absolutely devastating to redevelopment and major rehab projects. And just because I'm short on time, I've got two examples I want to show you. These both happen to, the first one happens to be a B&J Partnership property that was redeveloped some time back. This is 33rd and O. This is Starbucks. When we redeveloped that site, it was the site of an old communications business that had a large lattice type communication tower on the site. The building was dilapidated and ugly, and the only, and I think this may have been the first Starbucks in Lincoln, we were able to come in and build a new building, replacing the old building, installed a monopole tower in place of the old lattice tower, and of course installed parking that was adequate for the Starbucks and the other businesses in the building. But as you can see, for that project, street trees would have been impossible. Parking lot islands would have been devastating. The requirements to screen from the street would have been impossible to meet. And the required open space, again, would have been a killer. We would not have been able to build that project. And frankly, you know, this isn't a model of perfect urban design. It's not beautiful, but it's way better than what it was. This was a good project for Lincoln, but it could not happen under these design standards. Another one that I want you to take a look at is Piedmont Shopping Center. If we can back this out a little bit. Oh, that's the wrong button. Here we go. You're all familiar with it. It was old, worn out, dilapidated, and we rehabbed it. And it wasn't easy. We had to figure out how to get all the waivers that we needed for parking and access and circulation by doing a PUD on a site that was already developed. We had parking. We had trouble meeting parking requirements. We had trouble with setbacks. We had trouble with lots of things. But again, we had if we had required screening on site, no way. The screening for this parking lot is in the right of way. If we had been required to have landscaped open space to the extent that is required by this new design standard, not a chance. We couldn't meet it because we'd lose even more parking than we were already short. If we'd had requirements for shade trees and islands, we would have lost I don't know how many more parking stalls. And again, another good project for Lincoln, really good project. This was a really nice rehab of a center in a neighborhood that really needed it. It couldn't have happened under these design standards. So I want you to think a little more about what you're doing to existing development. It's one thing to be out on the edge trying to develop a cornfield and say, okay, I got to have an extra, 5% more land in order to make things fit, or 10% even, because you can adjust for those things out there. You can't adjust for those things when you have a lot in the interior of the city. You have a lot. You don't have the ability to say to your neighbor, oh, by the way, I need some of your ground for more parking. It just doesn't work that way. And I think this is going to be a real difficult issue for rehabilitation of a lot of places. And you think about Piedmont, for example. There are lots of other shopping centers around town, small neighborhood shopping centers that were developed back in the 60s and 70s when there were, when people thought 5 acres or so was big enough for a neighborhood shopping center. You go in and try to rehab one of those today under these design standards, isn't going to work. Can't do it. So I would urge you to just put the brakes on here and send this back to the planning department and say, look, it's one thing to do this or to do something similar to it. I think it's probably a little more than necessary, even at the edge. But it's one thing to do this at the edge of town, and when you're talking about new development. But to do this to existing developed property is just not going to work. Or you will dissuade people from rehabbing property that needs it. I'll answer any questions.
Questions?
Yeah, so could you elaborate a little bit on when you said that it wouldn't work today? What is it? What is it that makes you teeter over to not doing it?
Well,
is it the cost of the compounded cost of the screening landscaping requirements, or is it the layout?
It's not just cost. It's just the physical space. I mean, look at Piedmont. We by any usual measure, there's not enough parking there for the amount of space in that center. And if we had to go in and put those gigantic islands in every 20 spaces, we wouldn't be able to do this. If we had to put in a bunch of shade trees and add additional landscaped open space to this site, we couldn't do it because we'd be losing even more parking. And there's a point where you lose enough parking, you just don't have a project.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Others? Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kent Thompson. I'm here for two purposes. One is for the Lincoln Association of Realtors, and they have a letter that they'd like to submit to you folks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And then I'd like to go through my comments on this. As many of you may or may not know, I do a lot of active development, have a lot of properties that have gone through the rehab process, so could talk specifically to the cost ramifications. But I would like to just talk a little bit about the things that I see as a problem, and I'll go quickly through this. The cost of what you've already heard is expensive. We have islands in many of our parking lots. The trees die for lack of water, and a lot of that's because there's so much pavement around, and it just essentially evaporates the roots. Even our hard landscaping has very difficult times in these islands. We mound up snow on those islands, and that often will break things down. Then when we're using chemicals to keep the parking lot safe so people aren't slipping and falling, that obviously changes the soil composition. One of the major reasons that we're able to lease out our spaces to our tenants and to qualify for good quality tenants is the visibility of the property, and that's really essential. If they can't see the sign, if they can't see the parking, if they can't see the front door, we're not going to attract the tenants that are going to be able to stay and be able to pay the rents that we need in order to sustain these properties. And there's lots of examples of this throughout Lincoln, but probably the best and most prominent example that I can think of is how poorly the tenants are doing next to the new LPS shopping center because their front door isn't seen and their parking lot is not seen. And you just watch in a few years, you'll see what I'm talking about. The other thing that I always think about with this, with planning, is that they always have the first bite at the apple. And so now we have new standards that are coming along, and those standards are going to make it very difficult for me to think about going after a property when I have to jump through additional hoops, and will I be able to get what I need? My best example for that is the Bottlers building, where I'm looking at acquiring more parking, but now that I'm hearing this standard, I'm like, I'm not going to pick up that parking. But that parking would benefit those ball fields, it would benefit Lincoln High, and it would benefit my tenants. But not with these standards, I'm not going to do it because the guy wants too much money for his existing houses that I'd have to knock down. That's just an application of this. The other things that I think about with substantial cost of renovation, I can tell you that the renovation of an interior of a building in any of the older sections, so what's older? So for me, it's like 25 years or more is older. And I've built a lot of properties inside the last 30 years. So the cost of the renovation for those tenants clearly will exceed 50%. Now throw on the ADA standards. So when the question was asked if you're going to do any refinement to the exterior of the buildings, well, ADA is a major thing. I'm going to be using some of those things in a few years myself. So I'm concerned about making sure that my buildings meet those standards. Also, we can't keep our tenants coming if we don't keep our buildings looking good. It's kind of like, think about the inside of your house. If you don't renovate the inside of your house, it'll be discounted, the next person will, so you might as well do it now. Well, when I acquire my properties, I look at acquiring and redeveloping the outside of those buildings. You can see it about every 12 years, I recycle the exterior. All of a sudden now I've got to meet this landscaping. Am I going to do that? No, I'm not going to do that. This is very expensive stuff to do. I'm not going to tear up my parking lots to bring water in, and I'm not going to allow for the people who aren't familiar with islands to all of a sudden just drive across them with their cars. And if you haven't seen that happen in an island, you need to buy property like I have. The other problem that I find with trees in the parking lot is that we see a lot of people who avoid parking there because they wash their cars at these expensive places, and we know what birds do. So I think that, if anything, we need more parking for our restaurants. Our office buildings are being used a lot more intensively. And to that point, we're seeing about 3 times the volume of people in the office space as we did just 20 years ago. So those standards have really jumped up. Technology has really helped that densification of office space. But with that, I just wanted to submit those 2 letters to you folks, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Questions?
Go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Thompson, without getting too personal here, are the majority of your leases triple net leases, and then what does that impact look like long-term for your tenants?
I would say the majority of that is triple net. And so we can look at parking lot costs. Once you take out, the cost of real estate taxes, your parking lot and other common areas, so that would be the maintenance of the grass and lawns and the setbacks and all those areas. That's running us right now about $1.35 a square foot on a fairly good-sized piece of property. So on a smaller property, obviously that number would go up. And unfortunately, if those were in some of the near south neighborhoods, near north neighborhoods, you would not capture the tenant.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just the last thing you said, that if anything, we need more parking. Are you saying that just in general we need more parking, or are you actually opposing the parking requirement reduction in this proposed language?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Thank you. What I see in the rehabbing is pretty typical of what I see all the way across the city, and that is that back when a lot of these properties were built, the size of the lots were a lot smaller. And so you jammed in your parking as much as you possibly could. Piedmont was a good look. The Starbucks was a good look at that. But I see it all over the place. And so you barely have adequate parking, because back when those buildings were built about 50 years ago, most families had 1 car. And so now you've got a lot more people using, cars and vehicles and streets, and you're seeing that in the planning process. And so hence, a lot of people drive to their meetings, think of any coffee shop on 11th Street or any of those areas, and there's not adequate close-by parking. And if you think close-by parking is not important, go to your gym and look at what's by the front door. I mean, that's just the most oxymoronic thing I can think of. But yes, so my answer to you is a good restaurant, and we have a lot of great restaurants in some of these smaller areas around Lincoln, but it's very difficult to get parking spots, and I'm just like you. If I can't find a parking spot, I'm down to the next restaurant. So to keep things viable, I don't think we need less parking in these areas. I think we actually need more for restaurants and probably more for office space.
Do you believe that should be codified, or it's just a general, do you like the ordinance as it stands today as it relates to parking?
You can always have give and take. It just really depends on the circumstance of the property itself. But to say, hey, I'm going to give you, take away your parking requirements because now I'm going to put landscaping in, doesn't make sense to me. And I would tell you, on a lot of these rehab projects, you're not making big money. So if you're looking for me to put good money into this and my return on equity is like 5%, I'm on down the road. So there's not good margins in these rehab projects, just my experience.
Other questions?
No.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioner, Lincoln Zier with Hampton Enterprises. I will be brief. I've sent you a written communication. Excuse me, and I agree with a lot of what Ken is saying. And what Mark has said, I look at it from both perspectives, the interior of the city and the new development. One of the centers that Hampton owns is Meadow Lane. We happen to have a nice little burger restaurant there called Honest Abe's. Go there and try and find parking. It's tough. You would be taking out stalls in every row if we redevelop that thing, and we will. We have a redevelopment plan on the table today that we've talked about that would far exceed the 50% requirement because those buildings were built a long time ago. The 50% requirement is problematic in and of itself. First of all, anybody coming in to get you a permit is not going to give you the full value of their construction costs because they're paying for it. Their permit is based on their construction value, so they're not going to give you the full value. Number two, they're going to argue that a valuation sitting on the appraiser's site isn't appropriate, that we need to now go get an appraisal that's going to cost you $4,000 or $5,000. And you're going to end up in fights all over the place as to what does and doesn't constitute a 50% improvement. Legislative nightmare. Lastly, I think it's really ironic that in the cover memo to the staff report, a higher level of design to further economic development. You're talking about more money. And I'm not paying it. Every single small business owner in Lincoln is paying it. This is a tax, is what it is, because I'm going to pass that on. I'm going to pass it on through triple net leases. So yes, it's going to cost me more to build the parking lot, even on a new department, even on a new development. It's going to cost me more to put it in. It's going to cost me more to maintain it. And who's going to pay for that? The tenant. Not me, but small business owners. So in my opinion, it's a tax and needs to be really rethought and sent back to where we have some input on this. It's ironic in some respects that when you're doing a development, you have to go out and talk to neighbors about what you're going to do. But yet we get this, the Planning Commission decides to throw this on the table, and the developers are seeing it for, what, a total of 2 weeks? And we have had zero input on this, zero. No one called, no one asked. And I find that problematic. So, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Questions?
No.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Ann Post. I'm with Baylor Evans Law Firm. I'm also here on behalf of B&J Partnership. I wanted to just talk to you a little bit. I know this was presented as a package, and as there's both burdens to developers and new development and also benefits. And so Mr. Hunziker and a few of the others who have spoken here today have really talked about those benefits, or of the burdens, without really parsing out the benefits and who is benefited by that. As has been pointed out by Commissioner Harris, the supposed benefits don't fall evenly across the city. So when we look at them, three benefits that I want to talk about are the allocation of side yard parking, joint parking and reduction in requirements, and also the offsite parking requirements. So first, if we look at allowing parking in the side yards in the H2, H3, and H4 zoning districts, when we look at that, yes, that's a benefit that will allow parking as of right under certain circumstances. When we look at an overall zoning map, there is not, comparably to other zoning designations, there's not a lot of real estate in those districts, first of all. Next, when we look at the required side yards for H2 and H3 zoning, we've got a 5-foot minimum required yard. And this, while it allows parking in the side yards, also requires 6 feet of screening. So where there would be the circumstances that would allow parking in those side yards and for the screening is going to be extremely limited. So the benefit of that, it's small. I'm sure there's a property that benefits, but it's not a majority. Next is the joint parking and reduction in parking requirements. As you've talked about, and as Commissioner Beckius pointed out, yes, there's a reduction in parking requirements, but that really benefits where you have a shopping center, where you have multiple uses, where they can benefit from that shared parking. The problem is when you have a standalone restaurant, a standalone use, first, they can't benefit from that joint parking requirement. And also, as Commissioner Beckius aptly pointed out, I won't belabor it again, 8 parking stalls isn't enough for a restaurant. So while this is a minimum and you can go above that, this give to benefit in exchange for the cost of increased landscaping and landscaping islands, those smaller properties that have less flexibility aren't going to see the benefit of that. And finally, there's the more flexibility with off-site parking. I can tell you that in my experience, you develop or you place a business somewhere in spite of off-site parking instead of because of it. Every time you have off-site parking, you have to talk to each and every one of your customers to explain where that off-site parking is, how to get there, how to get to your front door. It's not an ideal situation. It's not something that you want to have. So while more flexibility with off-site parking is technically beneficial, it's still never the situation that you really want for your business. So there are all of these benefits. The actual practical benefit of them are extremely limited, and the areas and the properties that are going to be most benefited by them, either new development on the outskirts or in shopping centers, are not going to be the properties that are going to be most burdened by the landscaping and trees, understory and trees requirements, which are going to be those areas like Piedmont that Mr. Hunziker displayed in so much detail, where it's going to make redevelopment nearly impossible. And with that, I would take any questions.
Questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Richard McGinnis, and I'm here to talk a little bit about, I do commercial real estate is my full-time job, I believe. And what I'm finding today in our market is a lot of people are looking for affordable areas. We're getting more and more, I want to say boutique startups, entrepreneurs. They're looking for locations. And Lincoln's been very good about having those locations available. We've got the Piedmonts, the Rathbones, and these, but they're all filling up real quick. And what's going to happen is if we turn around and make someone redevelop those areas and put a lot of money into it and have less square footage, the rates are going to go up pretty steadily. Retail is kind of a fragile part of our business right now, and it will probably continue to be for a while. But I would like to see it easier for these redevelopments of some of these corners in town. Take 33rd and A. That'd be a great one. There's people out there that would probably love to do that. As more and more occupancy increases on these small centers, then there's going to be more desire to take some of these centers and redevelop them. And that's what I'd like to see more of. The other area I really would believe that's really ripe for redevelopment is South Street, between 10th and 17th. And if you had to go in there and you had to redevelop, and a lot of those buildings are very old, so there's car washes and other things, you're going to be way over 50%. And so this 50% deal is going to be kind of a scary situation for people not wanting to do it. And you say exterior of the building, that's great. But I look at over at 70th and Van Dorn, our friend Notter is doing an all-new exterior to his Oso Burrito. So that would kick off an idea that now we're doing something on the exterior, we're going to have to work on the street trees and such. The parking requirements, guys, we're going right over the parking requirements. Everybody's building way above what the city is asking for today. So lowering the parking requirements, I really don't see as any carrot, if that's what you're thinking, if it's a trade-off. And again, the other part of this is, again, we didn't hear about these until about 2 weeks ago. And so I'd like to see at least some chance to sit down with them and go through some of these, and maybe there could be some middle ground on a lot of this that could really make it work. And there's a lot of developers out there that go way beyond this, and they do it because they want to. You look at 20th and Pine Lake, the Whites down there. They've got beautiful landscaping. They've got great trees, and that's what they wanted to put back there. But they also have an empty building in the back that you can't see, but they do well. And so if you want to build something out like that, you can. But I wouldn't want to make it so it's that much harder for people to come to town and want to redevelop some of these little shopping areas in the middle of the town.
Questions?
Yeah, one quick question. So, Mr. McGinnis, just to reiterate what you said, you think that there is room for a negotiation here of what's been proposed and what have you, and you've seen examples of developers doing this on their own, and you think there's room for more discussion?
I do. I wish we could have had the discussion ahead of time. Maybe we won't come to an agreement, but at least we can have the discussion and they can hear our concerns about where this is going and such, and have a sit down. I know they've done it with urban design committees and a few others, and they took some of their suggestions. So it'd be nice to maybe step back a little bit and go through this a little better.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Tim Gergen with Clark Henderson Partners. Just want to start off by saying that I'm enlightened to hear Urban Design Committee come up with good comments as being a design review committee. I, as being a designer, agree with their concerns about the stormwater quality requirements. Oftentimes what we like to do as designers, try to put those in a bioswale. That's the most efficient way for stormwater quality. It's the best way for maintenance, but oftentimes our screening materials are not appropriate in a bioswale, and where we have those bioswales are in our outskirts of the parking lot. So I would like to get a little bit more discussion point with the conflicts with the screening requirements and the stormwater quality requirements. Those are a requirement, not if a developer wants to do them. Also, the street tree requirements are also going to be an issue for us in redevelopment areas. Oftentimes, the right-of-way areas in a redevelopment area are less than your standard 16.5 feet. So we have maybe 8 foot. We have room just for a sidewalk a lot of times, and we don't have room for a street tree requirement or the ability to place street trees in the right-of-way. We have to put them into the parking lots, which then reduces the amount of parking lot areas. So street trees are also a concern in a lot of our redevelopment areas where we often are not able to put those back into the proper areas. A lot of our concerns that I'm going to be voicing and a lot of that we've heard so far are in the redevelopment areas. They're not in your standard B2 suburban districts. These are more your B1s, your B3s. I think if we are having the chance to talk with planning department more thoroughly, I think we can come to a compromise in our zoning districts, in the B3s, B4s, B1s, the more existing urban areas. The minimum parking lot exemption is now being withdrawn, which I thought that was a great one for our existing urban areas. A parking lot less than 6,000 feet is now being required for a parking lot. Oftentimes we'll squeeze in a parking lot in a B4 downtown district right behind a building. We won't build all the way to the alley. We'll provide 5 or 6 stalls in the back. All of a sudden we've got to put in a tree in the alley in the middle of downtown because we don't have that exemption anymore. Those are some items that we'd like to discuss. Again, this is more B4, B3, B1 existing urban areas. Also, a lot of times the lots that are less than 150 feet deep, that's usually cause of a creation of lots that are up against arterial streets where the city has taken additional right-of-way from those lots and have made them that less deep. So Mark Hunsaker's example of the 33rd and O Street example of the Starbucks, that was back then, that lot was created off Highway 6, which was probably a standard 50-foot right-of-way. Now it's a 100-foot right-of-way. This lot is gotten a lot shallower, so we need those exemptions to be able to do those redevelopments along the arterial streets, especially along O Street. Also, we need some exemptions for the abutting parking lots. Oftentimes, in the B2 areas, we're able to work out a PUD. We're able to work out with our abutting neighbors to join parking lots and do the screening appropriately. But when you get into the existing urban areas, we can't assemble all those properties at a fair market price, and therefore we have to have parking lots that are not adjoining. And oftentimes they're going to have different elevations, or they're going to be different property owners are just not able to coordinate with each other on that. And to screen a parking lot from another parking lot just doesn't seem to make sense when valuable space in the B3, B1, and B4 areas are so much critical compared to a B2 suburban shopping center. So again, like I've said before, the examples that we've all talked about are more of the urban district and not the suburban. I think what was written and presented in the B2 and in the suburban area is a great addition to our city of Lincoln for additional landscaping. I think we just need to provide a little bit more thought in it as it is in for the urban areas. I'd happy to take any questions you may have.
Questions for Tim? Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Dustin Antonello. I'm with the Lincoln Independent Business Association, and here's a copy of my statement.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Lincoln Independent Business Association supports the beautification of our city and understands the desire to ensure that there is sufficient landscaping and screening in and around parking lots. However, we believe the current design standards already achieve this desired effect. The proposed changes only place additional burdens on the business community that exceeds basic needs, and do not consider any of the costs or problems associated with requiring more trees in parking lots. Some of those problems are as follows. Trees tend to die when surrounded by concrete due to excessive heat from surrounding pavement and the lack of adequate soil moisture. If it survives, the average life expectancy of a tree planted in a parking lot setting is only 7 to 10 years. According to the minutes of the October 25th meeting of the West Haymarket JPA, it will cost Pinnacle Bank Arena to replace just one dead tree $1,700, and that tree was planted surrounded by concrete and lived for only 5 years. More internal landscape islands within parking lots will also limit the amount of available space for parking. They are also not environmentally friendly. Trees planted in landscape islands require 50% more water than the same species in a grassy area. In addition, it will require more land to comply with these changes, leading to more sprawl. It will also be especially difficult for developments undergoing renovations to comply with these changes because they are dealing with a finite amount of land. More trees will increase the cost of landscaping maintenance due to costs associated with additional pruning and the replacement of dead trees. These costs will lead to higher triple net leases and rents. Tree roots can also damage surrounding concrete structures, which will increase costs to repair such damage. Trees block the views of security cameras and impede businesses' ability to monitor parking lots for the safety of its employees and its customers. This is a particular concern for the banking community. We've heard from 3 Lincoln banks that have expressed these concerns to us. Internal landscape islands will severely hamper snow removal and increase snow removal costs. Trees block the sun, making shaded or tree-covered parts of pavement among the most common locations for black ice. This can lead to more slips and falls and vehicular accidents in parking lots during icy conditions. And by and large, the benefits of the relaxed parking requirements do not outweigh the negatives associated with the landscaping changes for the parking lots. So based on these concerns, LIBA asks you to vote no on Text Amendment 18014. During the last 2 years, the Nebraska legislature has passed legislation to reduce unnecessary government regulation. This text amendment does the exact opposite and increases the regulatory burden on businesses. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.
Questions? Thanks. Testimony in opposition. Okay. Let's go back to staff questions then. Are there staff questions?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. My question is at the present time, or under this, if this were to pass, is there a waiver program available where, especially with these situations that have been shown that are legitimate problems for applying the new regulation?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the waiver process and also just mention that I think a lot of the comments we heard make it sound like the design standards don't have any flexibility. And in reality, I think there is some flexibility that allows for some of these things to exist in a more urban environment. So specific to the waiver process, if there was a request for a waiver, that could be approved administratively by our planning director. If he rejected that waiver request, it could come to you, the planning commission, and you could approve or reject it. If you rejected it, it could then go to council. So there are a number of steps along the way where someone could decide that this was worthy of a waiver. The other larger point I would make is, even though we're attempting in some cases to rein in some of these exemptions, there are still all kinds of allowances within the existing and proposed code that will allow, in particular, urban redevelopment sites to continue to do what they're doing. I'll just try to list off a few. For parking lot screening, and I'll use 33rd as an example, but maybe another corner of 33rd and O, the Godfather site that was redeveloped. If you go out there, there is no landscaping right now because of our current standards and the way they're written. In the future, if this was proposed, there would be a parking lot screen required on the two street fronting sides of that. But when we say landscape screen, that doesn't mean it has to actually be landscaping. And one alternative might be that that could be a low standalone masonry wall that only takes up 12 to 18 inches in space in terms of lot depth, but still meets the intent of the standards. I also have a few exhibits that we prepared to kind of help illustrate how these landscape islands might work. This is what I would call a fairly prototypical commercial development. This is at 84th and Van Dorn. It's, I believe, was done in the last 10 to 12 years, so it's a fairly recent example. And if you look at this exhibit, I've identified, if you can read this, two little green rectangles. Those represent the new islands that would be required as part of this new standard. So of the 202 stalls on this site, 2 of them would be required to convert over to an island. I also identified some areas in orange. Those are existing islands that don't have landscaping in them. So under the proposed standard, at least a portion of those islands would require some level of landscaping. But the point in showing this is to suggest that this does not represent a dramatic shift in how a site like this might get laid out. And it's possible that if they laid it out just a little bit differently, that reduction of 2 stalls might actually go down to 1. I'm also going to show, and forgive me, I don't have the exact location of this. We did some studies to try to analyze how this might impact potential sites. And so this is one we looked at. This is a very urban condition. This is somewhere along O Street. This is what it looks like now. It doesn't have islands. Under the new standard, this is what it would look like. There is 0 reduction in parking spaces in this example.
Is there any way you can make that small so they can fit on their side by side?
Yeah.
I know it's going to be really small.
Changed. Street trees. So you're showing an addition of street trees primarily. I see a couple of islands.
So the difference is these spaces like this, which are not usable parking spaces, now become islands. This little corner right here, which again is not a usable parking space under any reasonable scenario, now becomes an island. So I think a lot of times what you'll find is the islands take up those leftover spaces and don't have a dramatic impact on the actual number of stalls. So in this case, it was 0 reduction. In the other case, it was 2 over 200, so that's about 1% of all available parking that would be reduced. So I think there's a little bit of overemphasis on how this might actually impact the requirement for parking. I also, Piedmont was used as an example of a project that would be negatively impacted by this. I don't believe that to be the case. Number one, they do have islands, so I don't think they'd have any trouble meeting that requirement. They do have trees along the perimeter, so they're already meeting that requirement. They may not have parking lot screening, but they're required to do parking lot screening today. And so if they didn't provide that, and I wasn't here when this was done, but I believe that is part of a PUD, and then my guess would be that that would have been negotiated in the PUD process. When we look at those kind of redevelopment projects where there is a PUD or a special permit, some of the irregularities of a site can be negotiated and considered when we're talking about landscape requirements. So again, I guess my point would be some of the concerns were presented as this is hard and fast and there's no way around it, In reality, there's lots of that flexibility built into the code. I do finally want to just include one more set of examples. This is that same property at 84th and Van Dorn. There was some discussion about how parking lot trees or shade trees could negatively impact visibility onto a site. And so if you can see in that example, you can see where both Eat Fit Go and Scooters, their tree is being, or their signage is being blocked by a, I believe it's actually a parking lot tree because it's not in the right of way.
And that tree is existing today?
That is existing. But if you travel 20 feet down the road, all of a sudden that signage becomes very visible. If you go a little further, the Fairway Meat Market front sign is disguised by a parking lot tree. But as you go down the road, again, it becomes clearly visible. These are spaced at 45 feet, I believe, which is much tighter than the standard would propose. Street tree standard would be around 70 feet. So my point is that I don't think the obstruction is necessarily as prohibitive as it may be suggested.
I'm going to ask you a question about that particular site. They're eligible for a center sign, right?
They're eligible for what?
I'm not sure that's the appropriate terminology. For a center sign, you know, like one sign for the whole center.
I believe so, yeah.
And they choose not to have one at this time. So that would maybe alleviate some of these tree being able to see your business sign issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and that monument signage that's much closer to the street can be used to alleviate some of those concerns as well.
Quick question for you on the examples that you just used. Are those trees at full height?
They are, I would say they're not completely mature at this point, but they've been installed for, my guess is 10 years. So they're not babies.
Right.
So as they grow, the gap between them might shrink, but also the canopy, the height of the canopy will raise as well. So I think you will continue to get visibility into that site as a result as those trees age.
Sure. No, I think that's a really interesting example. The one interesting thing about that example as well is that Schlossberg owns the apartment community directly behind it as well. And so they may have done additional landscaping on that shopping center that they would not do in other places, say for instance at 66 and 0 where they have the Shopco, because of that apartment community that they own directly behind that site too. So it's an interesting site to use.
If I can do one more thing specific to street trees, I heard a couple comments about we just don't have room for them. And I just want to point out that as part of Parks and Rec's review of these projects, they do make a determination, is there room for a street tree? And so if we look at a lot of those smaller sites on O Street, the reality is no matter how you lay out the site, there is only so much right-of-way, and in many cases, a street tree won't be required because there's no room for it. So again, there is some flexibility in what the intent of the standard is versus how it actually gets applied with common sense.
I have a process question. We're going to get to discussion here in a minute after we get done with questions and rebuttal. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but we've heard numerous comments about it would sure be nice to have input. It seems to me that what you're doing right now, citing specific examples, there could be benefit to doing a couple meetings with the development community and having a back and forth in terms of here's what we mean, eliminate some of the confusion, show some examples. Would you see value in that?
I may defer that question
and you
to somebody
defer.
above my pay grade.
Again, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't want to put David on the spot either, but it's just that we heard that comment a lot.
Sure. David Carey with the Planning Department. I appreciate the question being asked. What I think is needed is, if you were asking me what procedure what would I suggest to do?
I'm not asking, but if you want to volunteer.
Well, I think that what we're asking for is a vote on the package by this body today, up or down, and then I would like to move it forward to the city council. And I think that there will be some time between now and a city council date that we certainly could have a meeting or two with interested parties that have voiced some concern today. And I think that would be appropriate, an appropriate way to handle that. I am not against at all having that conversation. I think the process that we took was, which is very typical of these types of text changes, is we put out for several weeks ahead of this hearing, basically a blast email out, and we try to find out what type of reaction are we getting. We got a little bit of reaction last week and this week, but not very much. We've gotten more today. Mm-hmm. So I think that's useful. It's informative. I think what Colin just went through is helpful to rebut a lot of that information, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that a meeting or two between now and going to city council with this package would be appropriate. So I would be open to that.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question to that. Can you tell us, because I think that this, when did you start working on this text amendment?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, because I think that there have been years and years of consideration of these types of ideas. So I mean, this current package, I think that this is something that got a lot of work put into it, starting probably, I would say, over the summer, but we didn't have any public conversation until what we entered into at this point in time. We were working on it at points in time and coming back around to it. But we didn't want to go forward with it until we felt like it was ready for discussion publicly.
Can I ask a procedure question?
Absolutely.
On this? If we were to vote this up or down, and it's going to go to the city council, if you were to come to some agreement with the developers in the meantime, would you take an amended version then to the city council?
Yeah, I think that's very possible, and we have done that in the past. When we have gotten to a point where as long as it does not completely change the package, if there are pieces and parts of what's being proposed that after some more conversation there was a agreement that we could amend the package, we could still move forward with the city council at that point. If there was complete disagreement on it altogether, I think we would just move forward with what was decided today. But we have done that in the past, where we have tweaked and changed the package when it went to city council, and then the city council was acting on something that at that point probably would be viewed upon more positively at that point. So that could be done.
Sandra, you had a question?
I did. It was a process question very similar to Dick's. I wanted to know what you would be willing to take to city council if it left here, and then you had conversations with developers. I wanted to know the degree of change that you would be willing to accept going forward to city council.
It's a hard question to answer, mainly because I don't think we know what the outcome will be of those conversations. I think that you can trust the staff and myself to be able to understand that if there were significant changes, then we would need to bring it back to you. We need to do some reworking on that. But if it was something that was the intent of what we put forward was still in place, and perhaps there were some changes within this package, I think that is a scenario where we would move forward to city council. But I think that there would still, from my perspective, still be enough benefit in the package to keep moving forward. That isn't a complete answer to what you asked, but I don't think I can answer it completely without the process moving forward at this point.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there other questions for staff at all? I mean, regarding anything? And is there additional rebuttal or things that you want to say before we?
I think Steve was going to do one more piece of rebuttal.
Okay.
Steve Hendrickson with the Planning Department. Partly just to add perspective, having worked on these text amendments for the last 3 years now, I was just coming up with a quick list. There's probably been about 12 to 15 parking amendments alone in the last 3 years. We reduced the parking requirement overall for B5, for alcohol throughout a lot of the cities, for restaurants in the B1 and B3. So we already done the parking reduction in B1 and B3. reduce it for home improvement stores, for medical offices, for townhomes in R5 to R7, for garden centers, for accessory buildings, for outdoor dining and seating areas, for domestic shelters, for mini warehouses. Those are the ones I could come up with quick off the top of my head, as well as those were part and parcel of another 50 to 60 amendments. Sometimes we were trying to improve parking. I can think we actually increased the guest parking in townhome areas because we'd heard so much from residents that they were concerned that there was an absolute lack of that. So sometimes the parking went the other way. But I'd say that's probably 1 out of the 15 or 16 reductions. So I think partly when you're looking at what are the benefits and pros and cons, are the things that are being requested balanced by what is being asked, it has to be really looked at in terms of the last 3 years, because we didn't really increase the landscaping in the last 3 years. It's coming to you here at the end with our last package of parking proposals. So I think that's something important to keep in the context. I would also say I agree completely with Colin. I think Piedmont is a great example of there were lots of standards already in place. Front yard setbacks, landscaping screens, street trees, parking lot trees are already required. And Piedmont's a good example of where when you're doing a redevelopment and you're trying to benefit an older neighborhood, you got to bend sometimes. You got to go the pros and cons. They put in some things perhaps they didn't want to do, and we moved some of the trees and things to the right-of-way. We got the sidewalk off the curb where it was in a horrible spot, and we moved it off the street, but we didn't move it far. So I would also say 33rd and O is also a good example. Is that really what we want in older communities? Do we want a standard where in new areas we have a lot of landscaping, but I have a lot of trees? And that's where we already are today. These are just a few extra landscaping requirements, street trees. It's not a dramatic change. And in newer areas, I agree with some of the people who testified, it'll probably be fairly easy to do. So in newer areas, we have very nicely landscaped areas with parking lot trees that people park underneath, including my wife, who will always say that's where she wants to park, particularly in the summer for the shade. But in older neighborhoods, 33rd and O. Not a tree, not a speck of landscaping. Is that what we want when 33rd and A redevelops? We want it to redevelop and not have any trees or landscaping whatsoever. And so I think these are some minor items that try to add some landscaping in older areas, has some benefits in newer areas. I'll also say a lot of what you heard is everyone wants parking, no one benefits from these. We hear from a lot of small business owners who actually want these kind of parking requirements. A lot of these are things we had heard over the last couple of years. We have independent business people who have 8 stalls for their restaurants, and they're required 10. And there's not a lot of flexibility. They're not in a B2, they're not in a use permit, they're not in a PUD. There's really nothing we could do for them. And so with this minor modification, we can now help the small business owner because we can actually reduce their parking requirement by 2 stalls. We also help the parking smaller business owner because they're the ones who come and say, I only have my stalls, but the guy 1 door over, he has 4 extra stalls. Shared parking requirement is kind of tough, though. Our way of doing it is rather clunky. We're trying to make that easier to use. We had a small business owner who, well, I'll have my employees park 300 feet away. Well, part of that lot was more than 300 feet away, so building and safety disallowed that shared parking arrangement because the whole lot was more than 300 feet away, and so they weren't going to allow it. So, I mean, these are the kind of things that we've included to actually benefit some property owners on the parking side, because particularly in older neighborhoods, it's tight, and we realize that, and that's why we've shown flexibility in the Piedmonts and those type of things, is we're trying to balance those things too, but we don't think it's right in older neighborhoods to have 0 landscaping. So I guess in terms of our rebuttal, yes, it's a package, but it's a package that's been developed over 300 years, and we think it's got some good for new neighborhoods and old neighborhoods, and good for the community as a whole.
Thanks. Anything else? Rachel, you done? You good?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
No more questions? Okay. I think we're ready to move on. Entertain a motion, discuss.
Move approval, core.
Is there a second?
I guess no one wants to talk about it anymore.
Second, Edgerton.
Okay, so we can discuss. Move in second. Discussion?
I'll go first. I'm a little stumped what to do about this process, because I personally want the input. It would inform my vote, the input from the development community, that is. I'm loath to start making motions to amend, and then sending it forward with some things not hashed out properly. I'm curious what my fellow commissioners feel would be the most efficient way to move this forward. We've had a request to vote it up or down, but it's going to depend. My vote is going to change depending on how this process goes forward.
Dick.
I am concerned about there not being some resolution with the development community, and I personally would lean towards postponing this text change until we get some feedback from the planning department on the results of that meeting and any changes they might propose.
Okay, I may be missing something, but, and I think I was told I was not supposed to use a particular word, so it's really hard for me to say this without using this particular word. But I think that these proposals were first presented back in 2013, 2014, and they were well flushed out at that time by both sides. I think the majority of this. So I guess I feel that all parts of the community have had ample time to put their input into this already. And so I have no problem sending it on to council at this time. I think that staff has done a good job. I do believe that when they did their rebuttal, we are hearing a lot of opposition about this is, a hard line. And we all, if you've been on this board for a while, we don't take a hard line hardly on anything. I mean, I was on the commission when we did Piedmont. I mean, yeah, it didn't meet all the requirements, but we're more than willing to work with you guys. Staff is, commission is. So, I mean, I really don't see any hard and fast problems with this as it's presented right now. I also think the development community has, they always like to go back and say, well, it's going to cost us all this money. Well, I've done street tree grants, and granted it has been a couple of years, but a street tree, 6 foot, 1.5 inch stalk, costs about $150. Now that might have increased over the past couple of years. So if we're looking at these street trees, and at most you're talking about increasing it 4 street trees, 4 times 150 is $600. Now, I have a hard time believing that a developer cannot afford $600. I can afford it, and I'm not a developer. I have a property where I'm doing massive internal inside renovations. I think that this is written just fine, that it will be fine. I mean, if I had to put in a street tree for $120, $150, I would gladly do it. I have no problems with this. I think this is a balanced approach. I think it's been well vetted. I'm also concerned that Lincoln is falling behind when it comes to design standards, and we need to maintain that and keep up with the rest of the communities.
I feel similarly to Maya. I came in having read all this information, but not having been on the Planning Commission in 2013 or 14, I'm not as familiar with the long history of parking text amendment changes. And but what I do care about and what I do pay attention to is public process. And what I hear today both in the comments that came forward before the meeting began and once this meeting began, is that there is some concern that the development community was not talked to directly in this process in the last couple of weeks. And because of that, I would be more willing to set this aside and ask that it be discussed and then a consolidated proposal come back, even if the proposal is very, very similar. What I want to know is that the development community has been talked to, has been integrated into the process, and that we don't move something forward to City Council that has our approval, hoping that there will be conversation and minor changes, but not being familiar, not being, fully aware of the changes. I don't want to send something forward to City Council that hasn't really passed the Planning Commission completely. So for that reason, I am very tempted to vote this down.
I would be willing to vote for a delay on this issue. I think that, and or down. I've never received the type of feedback on this that I have heard in some of the meetings that I attended, that I disclosed, on any other issue that has come before this body in the 2 years I've been here, which isn't a long time. But I concur with some of our speakers today. I don't think that we might necessarily reach a resolution or a consensus here as a group, but what I do hear are members of our community saying, we don't feel like we've been included in the process. We do have examples of other parties being included in this process, as disclosed by the Neighborhood Roundtable. But the development community did not have any subsequent meeting either, which falls in line with a line of thinking I think I've seen by the planning department. I would be much more in tune to delay this vote in order to force that discussion to a certain example. I don't have the control, if I were to vote this down and it were to move on for a city council consideration, to say, I want you to have a discussion about it. There's no input I have then at that point in time. I think that there are wild differences between people's perspectives here that I think we should be really mindful of and really thoughtful of when we go through this process. There are additional costs to developers on the upfront costs, but every person that rents commercial space in Lincoln has an additional cost or potential development additional cost here. That's a consideration, I think. So I would be certainly, if a commissioner here decided to delay action in order to have the development community participate in a conversation with planning department regarding this specific issue, I would support that and vote for that.
David?
I just have a piece of information to
Please.
share. Just hearing the comments coming forward, depending on what action is taken, the suggestion from staff would be that this would be delayed to the December 12th meeting.
Yeah.
Mainly because our next meeting
Yeah,
has a significant item on it. And
I was
just
going
wanted
to bring that up.
I
Thank
wanted
you.
to share that before we started
Yes.
taking some action.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Tracy, you want to say anything?
Just quickly, it constantly amazes me since I've been doing this work for the last 2 years how I'll read all the material and spend some time with it, think that I have a certain perspective or a certain viewpoint at that point, and then I come to this hearing and connect with much of the different information that's presented from various sides. And I appreciate those viewpoints, and that's, I suppose, the joy of the public process. I also would, although I voted, I seconded the motion, I also would appreciate the opportunity for this to go back and be provide additional review before it came back to us for a vote.
Yeah, I don't want to vote against this. I think that the general concept is solid. I would like for additional input to happen. I would be in the camp of delaying. I think delaying till the second week in December would be a good thing. With holiday next week, that would give time for some additional discussion. To me, I think there is as much angst about not having an understanding between development community and staff about what's in this. That's as much as anything. I don't think, personally, what I've heard is that the development community wants to kill this. It's just that there's some language things that have to happen here, and that kind of input I think would be very, very good. I think if we can find an opportunity to do that, this will be a stronger action in terms of the text amendment in the final. And I would rather move it to the council after that than doing it now. I think a number of people have talked that way. So let's go back to Maya, because you said that a lot of what you might think here just depends on what the rest of us think.
So yes, and thanks for all the input. I was prepared to vote because we had a request from the applicant to vote, and I think when you have a request from the applicant, it's fair to have a vote. And full transparency, I would have voted it down because I want the input to inform my vote from the development community to see how far apart we really are and understand if there truly is a way to compromise on these issues. I will say that I really want a clarification on what the motion was from the Urban Design Committee. If it was to eliminate the 50% rule, I'm personally not a fan of it. I think it's messy. And if this goes forward, I would most likely move to strike it. However, if the Urban Design Committee, through their discussion that was not in the minutes, came to a conclusion that it was somehow acceptable, I don't know if those minutes still exist or somebody remembers, but it sure would be nice, and I'm sure Mr. Houston remembers generally what his motion was. So that would give us some input to go on. And then I will also say that even though these may be small incremental costs, I am worried about B1 and B3. I'm on the record far too long and far too often about the grocery store exception for alcohol sales. As we went through in the open harvest application, I think the profit margin for business owners in these districts is so fragile. Even if this is a really small incremental change, I worry about the compounded impact, and that is, I need somebody to soothe my concerns before I can move this forward. So I'll make the motion to delay.
Well, we have a motion on.
Oh yeah, we have to vote on the.
Consider.
Yep.
So, yeah. So
Are we good on a vote?
Are we good to vote on the motion?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're ready.
You ready for the vote?
Yeah, and you want to just read the motion that we have on the table so everybody knows.
This is motion to approve text amendment 18014.
Okay.
Okay, Beckius?
No.
Campbell?
No.
Edgerton?
No.
Harris?
No.
Washington?
No.
Core?
Yes.
Shear?
No.
Motion failed, 1 to 6. 1 to 6.
I would move that we postpone the decision on this item until December 12th.
I second. Washington?
The only item I would add in terms of discussion is I would like to encourage the planning department to schedule a meeting with the development community in the interim and to provide to this commission feedback on that meeting.
Okay.
Including what Maya asked for in the potential revised minutes of the design.
Clarification of
Clarification,
what the
that's it.
motion was. Yep.
Clarification on the motion.
There may be a way that something could be added to this too, to exempt some of the older areas of the community from the new requirements.
I think that's part of the
I think
discussion.
that
could happen.
that should be part of the discussion, as well as to the degree that stormwater could be
Yeah.
discussed.
Okay.
I could look it up here, but urban design, when do they meet again? Are they gonna meet before that December 12th? Okay.
Okay, we're ready to vote?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, Beckius,
Yes.
Campbell,
Yes.
Edgerton,
Yes.
Harris,
Yes.
Washington,
Yes.
Core,
Yes.
Scheer.
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0.
Urban design meets on the 4th of December.
Okay.
Okay, moving on. Item 4.2 is change of zone 1A.
Jerry?
Yes?
I have a request from a commission member that would like to have a break.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Let's say 10 minutes.
Something similar. Sorry.
I think we're ready to continue.
Okay, item 4.2, change of zone 18030 from AG Agricultural District to AGR Agricultural Residential District on property generally located at 6705 West Van Dorn Street. Staff recommendation is for denial. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on this item?
See none.
Tom Chaka, planning staff. As Jerry said, this is a change of zone from AG to AGR on approximately 157 acres. The site is located at Southwest 70th and West Van Dorn. Site. There you go. 70th Street to the north, Van Dorn here on the north side. This area is the proposed site. We'll give you another perspective out wider. Area to the west is zoned AGR. The rest of this around it to the north, south, and east is all zoned AG.
Tom, while you're pointing out things, can you tell me where West Van Dorn Heights is on that map? That's
here.
okay. Thank you.
This site is shown to remain agriculture in the 2040 Comprehensive Plan Future Land Use Plan. The comprehensive plan also has language in it that discourages low-density residential within 3 miles of Lincoln. This is within the 3-mile extraterritorial jurisdiction of Lincoln. It is also in a growth tier. It's in Tier 3. The comprehensive plan also supports the preservation of land in the bulk of the county for agriculture. Some of the site, around the site, West Van Dorn is a 2-lane paved rural road, ditches on both sides. The site also, another thing to look at in change of zone is water. There was a report issued, and that was reviewed by the health department, and their conclusion was that there would be adequate quantity and quality of water for the potential of what could be 41 lots on this in this area here. Emergency services, that would be provided by the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office and the Southwest Rural Fire Department. If this was to develop, each lot would have its own private well and own private wastewater system. The other thing to look at would be existing acreages in the area, as mentioned. To the west is Ridge Park, and then Meadowview, and Meadowview Second Edition to down here. Ridge Park and Meadowview were both approved, changes zoned in 1995. So quite a while back. Meadowview Second Edition was approved with a change of zone, and the development was approved in 2005. At that time, this was not shown in yellow for future residential. Planning staff and planning commission had recommended denial to that change of zone, but city council and county board, because it is in split jurisdiction, but both the council and county board subsequently approved that. West Van Dorn Heights, that was also approved in 2005. Initially was submitted as a change of zone. That application was subsequently withdrawn, and they came back with a AG community unit plan, which was approved. Community unit plans approve smaller acreages, but also require 70% to be preserved as open space. As part of this application, Planning Department did a review of existing and potential dwellings on property zoned to AGR or shown for future AGR as yellow on the future land use map. The analysis showed a potential for another 2,580 dwelling units county-wide, and this does not include the potential acreages within other towns' extraterritorial jurisdiction. If you were to add the other towns' jurisdiction outside their village limits, but within that 1 mile, that would add another 3,678 dwelling units, bringing the total countywide to a potential of 6,258 units. There's been an average over the last 3 to 5 years of about 100 dwelling units, acreage units per year. So that would allow several decades worth of acreage development. In addition to looking county-wide, we also focused on a sub-area. Let me find that map. Well, sub-area was basically from Van Dorn down to Denton. Here it is. And from southwest 112th to southwest 56th Street. So it does include Denton Road's down here, Van Dorn up here. This yellow area here is Denton's 1 mile jurisdiction, so it does include a portion of Denton's 1 mile. Again, we looked at potential units, both not including Denton's jurisdiction and including it.
Tom, can you point out the property on that map?
Oh, it would be right here.
Okay, thanks.
And yellow signifies, again, what?
Yellow is what's shown as low-density residential on our future land use map.
Thank you.
As you can see, all of Denton's extraterritorial jurisdiction is shown as yellow. Mm-hmm. That's in their comprehensive plan.
And the green is?
Natural resources, greenway, could be floodplain, some floodplain.
Is it part of the Prairie Corridor over there, the green? Part of it is in the spot for it.
Part of it. Part of it is. Yeah. I thought it was further out.
No, it's on the that side of Denton. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the sub area, we calculated that there was potential for 361 dwelling units. And if you include Denton's area, there's an additional 248 acreage developments. Also wanted to show you and reference that this is not that far removed from the city limits. It's approximately 1.5 miles. Again, here's our site. The city limits would be right here, Pioneers Park, Pioneer Golf Course, etc. Again, this is Van Dorn.
Tom, can you tell me, all that development just north of Pioneers Park, is that R3 or R? I'm assuming it's not AGR.
It's not in this.
Don't have. I'm sorry, I don't have that zoning.
Outside city limits.
It's AGR.
Okay, thank you.
So based on our analysis of potential acreages shown as yellow or already AGR that's not developed, there's enough out there to for a 60-year supply based on current demand. We also, over the years, have found that there is issues with when the city grows out to annex acreages, as we have found in the last few years. And Andrew is going to take over right now and kind of go over some of the issues with annexations and where we're headed with that.
Andrew Theroff, planning staff. So yes, as Tom mentioned, I'm going to briefly touch on annexations. First, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about our growth tier map and just where this is on there. So this is our growth tier map, which all of you are, I think, familiar with. This is out of our comp plan. The yellow area was the existing city limits at the time this was made. And then the pink, red, and dash lines are our 2040 growth areas. So that's our tier 1 growth areas. The dark green is our tier 2 growth areas. So that would be roughly 2040 through 2060. The light green is our tier 3 growth areas. So that would be after 2060. And then the white areas are not within a growth area, so along the edges there. This property is roughly right there where that red dot is. So it's in a tier 3 growth area. So it's not an immediate growth area. It's 26 year beyond, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the city will be to this property within the next 40 to 60 years. The reason we can say that is if we look at the wastewater plan from 2015. It's kind of hard to see here, but the property is right there. It's that little red dot. Just south of there is the Haynes branch of Salt Creek. That's planned to be a major trunk sewer line in the future. There's significant branches coming off of that directly to this property, which means that this property can be urbanized. It's sewerable. We have a plan to provide sewer to that area. It's not going to be today. It's not going to be in the next decade, but sometime in the next 40, 50 years, this is going to be an urban part of Lincoln. So looking at annexation, why do we want to avoid placing acreage subdivisions in growth areas? You know, what's the big deal? There's a couple main points with that. The first is our growth areas are meant to be protected for future urban development. So what that means is, as much as we can, preserving those today as agriculture use. As you know, it's easy to convert farm fields to future urban development. It's much more difficult to convert acreage subdivisions to urban development, if not even impossible, just because there's so many different ownerships. It's hard for one single entity to take control and subdivide that for urban uses. The other challenge with putting acreage subdivisions in our growth areas is that it is city policy to annex acreage subdivisions once the city gets up to those subdivisions or even surrounds those subdivisions. We have a lot of reasons for doing so. Some big ones are taxpayer equity. If an area is surrounded by urban development, all their neighbors are paying the city tax rate, it makes sense for them to also pay the city tax rate as well. It also clarifies things for on a jurisdictional level. So if you're outside the city, it's county sheriff, rural fire. Inside the city, you have LFR, city police. So if an area is surrounded by the city but not in the city, you have a situation where there's city fire responding to some things, and then for a while, for the area outside the city, it becomes rural jurisdiction. It's just very confusing. So it makes sense. There's a lot of reasons why it makes sense to annex acreage subdivisions once the city gets there. But city-initiated annexation is a tough process. Most of you were here for that last year when we annexed a few different acreage subdivisions. Tom mentions them in his staff report. It's hard for staff. It takes a lot of time. It's a hard decision for planning commission, hard decision for city council. I think most importantly, it's really tough for the property owners themselves. Property owners, as they're getting annexed, they see that as a big hardship on them. People move to acreages because they don't want to be in the city. But when we put these acreages in growth areas, all we're doing is creating a future conflict, because within a growth area, these acreages are eventually going to be in the city. They're going to be annexed at some point, and we're going to have a lot of unhappy property owners. I think probably the best example of this recently is Hillcrest from last year. Hillcrest was approved in 1956, so just about 60 years ago. So, well, a little over 60 years ago. So it was approved in 56. In 2017, 61 years later, we're dealing with annexation. Takes a lot of time, and then you end up having a lot of property owners who are upset. They have a lot of questions. They don't know why the city is doing this. It's just a tough situation for everyone involved. And really the way to avoid that is to not put acreage subdivisions within growth areas. Tom went over the numbers. We have ample supply of potential acreage areas already. Putting another acreage subdivision within the growth area is really just creating another headache for everyone involved, including the property owners in the future. So that kind of goes into our recommendation of denial. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I did want to mention one more thing. Going back on some of these adjacent or nearby developments, the one in particular I want to address is Meadowview Second Edition down here. As I said, that was originally approved in 2005. There are still 30 lots within that development that were on the approved preliminary plat that have not yet been final platted. So just within this development here, there's still a potential for another 30 acreage lots. In addition, just as like they did up here, an alternative would be to do a AG community unit plan. Granted, that makes the number of permitted lots go down substantially, but it would allow 10 lots, or if they used a community sewage system, they could have, the density would go up to 12 lots. Take any questions?
Would staff support a CUP AG application on this site?
I couldn't say for sure without seeing it, but typically we typically support AG CUPs.
What are the differing necessities the landowner has to do to go for an AG CUP as opposed to what they've asked for today?
Well, today he's only asking for the change of zone.
Change of zone.
If
Okay,
it
so
was
that's just
approved, he would then come back and do either a preliminary plat or a community unit plan. The same requirements, whether it's a AGR CUP or an AG CUP, you still have the same same requirements of a site plan, grading drainage plan, street profiles.
Other questions? Don't see any. Thanks. Testimony, oh, Steve, do you have, okay. Testimony from the applicant?
Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission, Mark Hunziker, appearing on behalf of Green Estates LLC, the applicant. I have some handouts on my.
Thank you.
Tom touched on some of these things that I'm going to talk about, and I think it's important for you to kind of put these areas in context. I mean, the area that we're talking about here is, as he said, within Tier 3. But I think it's important to just kind of get an overall picture of where acreage developments are permitted in the county, or at least anticipated to be in the county. You would get the impression from reading this staff report that it's all a very orderly and detailed planning process that cites these acreage developments. And as you can see from the first showing here of the county as a whole, they're spread out all over the place, and there's no particular clustering of these areas or any sort of clearly planned area. This is a little bit more of a close-up of Lincoln. This is the dashed line on this map indicates the future urban area as within Tier 1. And as you can see, there are a number of those within Tier 1, some of which are already within the city, some not. But there are lots of them out there, and there are areas where they are going to need to be contended with at some point as the city expands. Now, the city in Tier 1, Tier 1 is an area of 52 square miles, which includes the existing city plus everything that we anticipate needing for urbanization until the year 2040. That would mean an additional 40,000 dwelling units and 106,000 more people. Now, Tier 2 is huge. Tier 2 is another 34 square miles. It's over 60% the size of the entire area within Tier 1. And that means we're going to add, and it's planned to add another 111,000 people. That 42,000 dwelling units or so actually only takes up about 2/3 of Tier 2, and it will provide enough land for an additional 23,000 or another 61,000 people beyond 2040. And Tier 3 is really gargantuan. It's 131 square miles, and I'll show you where that is on here, and also I've X'd where the existing acreage areas are. It's 131,000 131 square miles, probably 250,000 additional dwelling units, and about 660,000 additional population. That takes you out a long, long way. And the suggestion is provided in the comprehensive plan is that Tier 3, little active planning or utilities or service delivery is likely to occur in the near term in Tier 3. However, it should also remain in its present use in order to be available for future urban development. Now, that's a suggestion that these properties that are out there in Tier 3 ought to just be frozen in time out somewhere beyond 2060, but we're not sure how far out beyond 2060 until the city of Lincoln gets around to saying, hey, we really want you to come in and be part of the city. Now, that's really not very fair. We're talking about a piece of ground here that's not particularly good farm ground. The staff report indicates that very little of it is prime farmland. So, you know, you could make the argument here that we've really allocated way too much land for future urbanization, depending on what future circumstances may hold. But whatever you decide about that question, it's simply unreasonable for the city to say that these owners of marginal farmland ought to wait another 50 or 60 years before they do anything with their land. This is a reasonable proposal. There are acreages out here. This is very good land for acreage development because it's got good water and it's got paved roads to it. If you decide to deny this kind of a proposal out here, what you're going to see is more of what Tom was pointing to in the way of additional AG community unit plan type of developments, and you're going to end up with this kind of stuff all the way along Van Dorn on both sides, all the way into town. Why not have a quarter section of land where you get some of that development off of Van Dorn, let them have interior roadways rather than having everybody using Van Dorn all the time, and allow these people a reasonable use of their property? I think this is every bit as reasonable as every other one of those yellow areas that are shown on that map. This is within an area that is very well suited to acreage development. We're not taking prime farmland out of agricultural production, and it enables this family, who is no longer able to farm this land, an opportunity to get a reasonable return on the land that they have without waiting for their grandchildren or great-grandchildren to realize it. And I would try to answer any questions you might have.
Questions? I don't see any. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do you have testimony in support? Do we have testimony in opposition? Do we have staff questions? Okay. No applicant rebuttal, I don't think, since there's no staff questions. So I guess we're ready for a motion.
I would move that we approve the change of zone from AG to AGR.
I would second. Beckius?
Okay, discussion?
Dick, do you want to go ahead? Or?
I was just going to say, if you look on what Mark passed out, if you look at where the X's are of low-density development, they're all around that area. And I can't see postponing for 50 years or so a piece of ground that is right around all other low-density areas. I can understand staff's recommendation, but I don't agree with waiting that long.
Okay.
I fully understand staff's recommendation. The problem that I have is we have the makings of a good site for an acreage development in every other way but the comprehensive plan. I would be certainly more interested in having a discussion about what triggers automatic annexation to acreage developments and what have you going forward as time goes on, rather than limiting the ability for property owners to use land that really may not have a substantive use for decades. So I'll vote for the change in zone.
Others? Okay, I'm gonna not support the motion. I think that I always have and will continue to, as I interpret the comprehensive plan, try to follow that. And I think as I weigh that, I see arguments, I see the argument both ways. But I'm more persuaded to, in terms of how I interpret the comprehensive plan and goals, to not vote for the motion. But I see both ways, so.
I'll add to that. I feel the same way. I agree with both sides, but I'm going to be voting with Dennis because I do think it's pretty clear that it's not supported by the comprehensive plan.
Right.
I may not agree with it, but it's, and it maybe merits a discussion, like Tom said.
Yep. Anyone else? Okay, I think we're ready to vote then.
Okay, this is for the approval of changes zone 18030. Beckius?
Yes.
Campbell?
Yes.
Edgerton?
No.
Harris?
No.
Washington?
No.
Core?
No.
Shear?
No.
Motion failed 2-5.
Okay, at this time, anyone wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda may do so.
Oh,
Do you want to move for approval?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Or
Yeah,
move for
yeah,
denial, I'm
we
sorry.
have to do that. I'm sorry, So, would someone like to offer a motion to approve?
To deny.
To deny, I'm sorry, to
Or
deny.
no, sorry.
Yeah.
To
Deny.
To deny, yes, yes, I'm sorry.
Move denial.
Okay,
I will second that.
okay. I know.
I support the comprehensive planning process. I certainly understand the proposal put forward, and I can understand the arguments in favor of moving this to AGR, but I think that the comp plan was gone through in a very thorough process, and I think there's value to that. I think there's room here for a CUP to come forward outside of, to stay with the comp plan, but still come forward with a CUP in the ag zone, and I would encourage the applicant to look at that. I know that it looks like past decisions make this feel like a fait accompli, that if our neighbors can do it, then we can do it. And they were not operating under the 2040 comp plan, and I would like to give some respect and support for the planning process that led us to that comp plan, and urge that we do everything we can to support that.
Anyone else? Tracy?
I want to support the comp plan too, and I do want to encourage the applicant to come back with a CUP if they, I know that's going to cost more money to do that, but that I think would be the best route to go. I guess I'm just stinging a little bit from all these city proposed annexations that we had in the past year and how difficult that process is for those people when they live on the acreage and they're expecting one thing and then all of a sudden they're swallowed up by the city. And that can be pretty tenacious.
Anyone else? Okay, I think we're ready to vote.
Okay, this is for the denial of changes zone 18030. Beckius?
No.
Campbell?
No.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Motion carried 5-2.
Okay, now, at this time, anyone wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda may do so. If not, we are adjourned. Thank you.